Chapter 275. The Shire. Brando nodded. Of course, if there are any skilled craftsmen in the city, you can keep an eye out for them. Brando thought for a moment, but he did not have much hope in this suggestion. Craftsmen who knew how to build cities were all renowned masters in this era. Even Brando himself did not believe that a remote place like Abyss would be filled with hidden talents. This was not a novel, and Bosley's incident was just a special case. But when Brendel said this, he could not help but feel a little troubled. That was true. Building a fortress, especially a large one, was not like playing a game. No matter how much resources were consumed, the system would directly deduct them from the inventory. Then with a beep, the system would place a fortress in the middle of a dense forest. In this place, clay and stone would not automatically flow up to the walls. Even a brick would have to be burned out of the kiln before it could be sent to the construction site. The labor force was not just a number. If you just put people together, they would be nothing more than a black hole that consumed a lot of food day after day. How to arrange and coordinate manpower was a very professional skill. Although simply put, it was how to let 100 people exert the strength of 100 people instead of 50 or even less people. It was very difficult to do. Brando had experience in managing a small number of people, but once the number of people rose to thousands or even tens of thousands, there was nothing he could do. After all, this was not a war. First, he had to know what these people were supposed to do. He had some of the best candidates in mind: the craftsmen of Buga, the mountain dwarves of Roland, or the gnomes of Jorgendy Ridge. They were all the best craftsmen in the world of Vaunt. But the best were not necessarily the most suitable. First of all, other than the craftsmen of Buga, Brando had no idea where to find the dwarves or goblins. The dwarves of Roland lived in the north, which was even further north than St. Tossel. The mountains there were covered in snow all year round. In Erwin in the south there was no sign of this tribe. As for the dwarves, there were quite a few of them, but their distant relatives were wine connoisseurs and had nothing to do with building cities. As for the goblins, there was no need to mention them. The earth goblins were a noble race under Jorgendy Ridge. Not only were they masters of city construction, but they were also one of the races with the best fighting skills. They did not need to come to the barren surface world to suffer like Tajif. The only ones he could find were the craftsmen of Buga, the white-bearded old men of the Silver Alliance. Brando did not expect them to take a liking to him. Those old men were not like these country bumpkins, according to the Buga wizards, who did not know much. Brando suspected that these silver folk might have guessed his identity as a transmigrator in a few words. Brando did not have any other ideas at the moment. He could only take one step at a time. Although there was no way he could come up with a solution in a short time, as time passed and his strength increased, he might be able to find an alternative. In the end, he could only add, "Go ahead and do it. I believe in your ability." It was this sentence that made the noble lady's eyes light up, and she nodded seriously. But at this moment, a young man's voice came from outside. "I think I heard you call me, my lord." Not far away, Scarlet, who was leaning against the black pine, turned her head subconsciously and saw the Shire in a black robe coming in from outside. In fact, the young archmage rarely appeared in front of outsiders after the chaos that night. It was as if he plunged into the small room in the castle arranged for him, and did not care about the outside world. Of course, according to the Shire's explanation to Brando, he was familiarizing himself with spells. After all, an apprentice would need a buffer time to become a wizard mentor overnight. Now it seemed that this guy was doing well these days. When Brando saw him, the young wizard's face was relaxed and even a little excited. It seemed that the outside world was indeed more interesting than the graveyard. Even if he stayed in a small room all day, it was no exception. "Why are you here?" Brando asked, but he immediately saw that the Shire did not come alone. There was a young man behind him. Brando recognized the young man. He was the only lucky or unlucky person left from the group of adventurers they met when they first entered Abyss. He was an apprentice who was a string magician. But this young man had been staying in the group ever since they killed Grodin, which puzzled Brando. According to what he knew, this young man and his companions were from noble families. Even though they did not have much power, they were at least descendants of nobles. With such a background, there was no need for them to fool around with these mercenaries. According to Amandina's words, this group of mercenaries were rebels, But to put it bluntly, they were not far off from bandits who occupied a mountain. It could only be said that the real bandit group lacked people like him and the noble lady who understood the rules of the game between nobles. The Shire smiled and walked in front of them. He respectfully bowed to Brando. If an outsider saw a magus bowing to a noble in such a manner, their jaws would probably drop to the ground. But the young magus still greeted him meticulously. "My lord." In fact, his actions had already surprised the young man behind him. The young man, who was habitually wearing a green-gray robe, finally showed a strange expression and looked at the master and servant. Even though Brando was a gold-ranked swordsman, the Shire was not to be outdone. Although it was a little disgraceful, but now it seemed that the decision back then was really a wise one. Twilight's paintings were highly sought after in the collector's market, and it was not impossible to sell it for a few million Tor coins. Although this was not a lot, it was enough to solve the urgent problem. But there was no market for this item in Abes, and if he wanted to sell it for a good price, he had to find the right place. Brando already had a target in mind at this time, and that was Erewhon's only free port, Ampere-Seal. He could not help but think that he really needed someone to go to Ampere-Seal to take a look. Not to mention that Baron Abes would definitely establish a trade relationship with this free port in the future. The intricate power relations there were enough to attract real political adventurers to invest in it. Especially at this time of the year, with all kinds of armies pressing in, Brando guessed that Ampere-Seal must be very lively right now. Thinking of this, a confident smile appeared on his face. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 276. Ampere-Seal. The girl sitting on the bench looked at her best friend in shock. She was the half-fairy princess, with her long silver hair hanging loosely over her princess dress, her body as slender as a doll, and her silver eyes filled with calmness. However, this seemingly weak girl was known for her strong character in the circle of nobles. She always carried a silver dagger inlaid with emeralds. It looked like a dagger used by noble ladies for self-defense, but Magadol did not doubt that she could easily subdue a grown man with that dagger. Of course, this was still not the right way to put it. This princess was famous for her swordsmanship in the royal family. Even an official knight of the kingdom would not be her match. The girl pressed her hands on her knees, and could not help but feel envious. She was also a princess from the dukedom of Manticore. She had known Grafine since young, and the two had always been close friends. However, she was envious of Grafine's ability to naturally show her strength. Even the smallest details in her movements showed the princess's extremely independent character. In comparison, she had grown up learning strict aristocratic etiquette. Although she was well-educated and knowledgeable, outsiders had always seen her as a gentle, quiet, and elegant young lady. It could even be said that she was the role model of most noble ladies in Wonde. However, Magadol did not like such praise. She wanted to be free to pursue the life she wanted. However, she did not know what kind of life she wanted. Furthermore, her serious character forced her to take responsibility for her own destiny. The dukedom of Manticore was just a small country in the north of Erewhon. For a girl like her, her future was already set in stone. "Why do you suddenly want me to go to Ampere-Seal, Grafine? Is it because of the war?" The half-fairy princess nodded her head. Suddenly there was a loud commotion outside the balcony. Knights were sparring in the square outside. However, the commotion quickly subsided, and it did not affect the conversation between the two in the room. "Has the situation become so tense?" Magadol asked softly. "What do you think, Teeny? My brother's actions are faster than I thought. The dukes have already formed an alliance. Although that old fox Arek is still hesitating, I think he will make a decision soon." The silver-haired girl explained unhurriedly, as if she was talking about something that had nothing to do with her. "Maybe there is still a chance, Grafine." Magadol could not help but say. "It's not that simple, Teeny. Arek has always been ambitious. He wants to stand with my dear brother, or stand with us." The half-fairy princess paused for a moment and said faintly, "I don't mind the marriage, but I am worried that it will harm Haruz." Thus, the young girl sitting opposite her no longer spoke, but looked at her calmly. The two of them were close friends, and understood that the other would not be stumped by this little difficulty. Griffine would not be Erwin's princess if she did. Actually, my main concern is Count Randner, the silver-haired girl lowered her voice. If Dukarek is like a dark cloud in the northern sky that can bring a storm at any time, then as long as the wind is blowing in the right direction, he may not necessarily be our enemy. He can also be our ally. But I suspect that Count Randner will draw his dagger at us from behind at any time. Magadol's brown eyes flashed with interest and she suddenly said, I heard something that you might be interested in, Griffine. Go ahead, Teeny. The princess of the Manticore Dukedom leaned closer to Griffine. I have a friend who just sent me a magic letter from Count Randner. He said that Count Randner seems to be in some trouble, and there are some rebellions in his territory. I think he might not have the time to care about things outside of his territory for the time being. Is it a friend from the Holy Cathedral? The half-fairy princess asked seriously. Magadol nodded slightly. The silver-haired girl looked at her close friend seriously. Even though she did not have any elven blood, her beauty was not inferior to her own. However, they were completely different. Her soft golden hair seemed to be plated with a layer of holy radiance under the soft light, setting off her quiet and gentle face. It wasn't without reason that this young girl was called the Frowning Angel, although such beauty was extremely rare among humans. Griffine could not help but think of an ancient human kingdom's queen. But the queen's fate was too tragic, and this made her frown slightly as she shook her head and threw the thought out of her mind. Magadol herself was an extremely devout believer, and she was very close to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. At the same time, she also maintained a very good personal relationship with many of the priests in the Holy Cathedral. Because of her close relationship with the Holy Cathedral, she was jokingly called the Nun Princess by many nobles. The high priest of the Holy Cathedral had publicly praised this girl's devotion to her faith, and it was also because of this that the Nun Princess was not harassed because of her beauty. This was because the reality was often like this. Between royal authority and divine authority, the former made people yearn for it, while the latter was more revered. Teeny, do you remember a joke we heard when we were learning about royal etiquette? The half-fairy princess suddenly asked. In Erewhon there is no lord who does not deal with a rebellion or two. Otherwise, he is not a true lord. Magadol smiled slightly, most likely because Griffine's words reminded her of the carefree days of the past. It's actually the same everywhere, Griffine. Yes, the silver-haired girl nodded. So don't put your hopes on others. Let's just hope that Count Randner will be flustered for a while. But we still have to do what we have to do. Then what can I do, Griffine? I hope that you can use your relationship with the Holy Cathedral to persuade the merchants of Ampere Seal to reject the Alliance's request. The half-fairy princess replied. Teeny, the free port is under the protection of the Holy Cathedral. They have the ability to do so, but I'm worried that the merchants will be tempted by the benefits. I know the presiding priest of Ampere Seal. I can give it a try. Magadol thought for a moment and asked, But when do I have to leave, Griffine? There's no need to rush, Griffine said. Once you leave my place, I'm guessing that the dukes will immediately receive the news. This is a dangerous matter, Teeny, you have to think carefully. Although you are my good friend, I don't want you to get into any trouble. That's why I want to help you, Griffine. Thank you. The silver-haired girl looked at the direction of the balcony, and the loud cheers from before rang out once again. This meant that one of the battles had been decided. Her silver eyes flashed. Let me help you choose a few people who can complete this mission with you and protect your safety, Teeny. Then of course I want Sister Maynard. Magadol's face revealed a rare sly look. She would only reveal this side of hers in front of Griffine. If she's with me, I'll have someone to chat with and relieve my boredom. The princess smiled. You're not the least bit courteous, taking away my best knight. But since that's the case, I can only reluctantly part with her. But you have to take good care of Sister Maynard. Her temper is much worse than mine. Of course. Magadol blinked. In reality, the three of them were close friends who had known each other since they were young. They understood each other's personalities the best. Although Maynard was born with a cold temperament, she was not someone who would throw a tantrum at others. At this time, cheers rang out from outside the balcony again, drowning out all the sounds in the room. This time it was different from the previous times. The cheers did not stop for a long time, And the two who were familiar with all of this understood that this meant that the final stage of the night tournament was about to begin. The half-fairy princess was distracted by the cheers. She raised her head, her silver eyes sparkling. After a while she opened her mouth. "Let's go, let's see which outstanding young people are lucky enough to be with Teeny." Magatal smiled and nodded. The second round of the tournament was about to begin. Freya's palms were sweaty, and her heart was pounding. If the audience outside the balcony could take a closer look at the face of this girl from Wuxia, they would definitely notice that her face was as red as a ripe apple. She was panting heavily, sweat dripping down her sharp chin, and the back of her uniform was already soaked. The consecutive battles had taken a toll on the future Valkyrie's stamina. She had defeated many opponents along the way, and had attracted the attention of many people. As a new member of this batch of young students, her performance could be said to be outstanding. However, Freya knew that she was not the only one like this. On the other side of the balcony, Breton and 3 other students had also become the most dazzling existences of this batch of young students. She wiped the sweat off her chin with her hand. Compared to them, she could be considered as the least outstanding one. In the previous battle, Breton only used 3 moves to defeat his opponent, a member of the Knight Reserve who was 1 level higher than him. When Freya saw this scene, she realized that the impulsive and immature youth in the past had become much calmer and more mature. His swordsmanship had also improved to such an extent. Freya could almost imagine Breton's amazing talent shining brightly on his sword. He had found his place, and this was the best stage for him to show off his skills. However, compared to him, she was still a little confused. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 277. Freya knew that she did not have that kind of talent. Ever since she was in Wuxia, she used her unyielding personality to make up for the difference. She put in a lot more effort than others, and slowly made up for the difference between people. But things were not as simple as she thought. As time passed, Freya gradually realized that the difference between people was not something that could be made up with hard work. Just like in this academy, there were too many capable people, and she was simply insignificant in this crowd. She was like a tiny firefly under the bright moon, and the little bit of pride she had in Wuxia had completely disappeared. In front of her was a knight student from the upper year. He had the strength of a middle silver-ranked knight, and was on par with Breton. In fact, if this competition did not limit the strength of the participants to the peak of iron-ranked, she would have already fallen to the ground. But even so, she could feel her hands trembling as she gripped her sword. The upper-year student who was frowning was also carefully circling around her. Freya's tenacious fighting style had caused him to suffer quite a bit. The annual championship competition of the Royal Cavalry Academy had a rule that everyone complained about. There was no time to rest between matches, and everyone had to pay the price for wasting too much energy in the previous battle. It was said that the founder of the academy set this rule to let the students understand that no enemy would give them reasonable rules on the battlefield. They had to learn to conserve their energy, and only then would they be able to survive longer on the battlefield. The original intention of the Royal Cavalry Academy was to send the best military talents to this ancient kingdom. In times of peace, the students who graduated from the academy were all trained as middle and high-ranking officers. Those who graduated with excellent results were even selected to enter the Royal Knights Regiment the moment they stepped out of the academy's gates. Thus, there were many people who reached the heavens in a single bound. Just like this annual championship competition, the Knights competition was carried out using a point system. Students of different years would be able to obtain a corresponding amount of points by fighting, and a cruel elimination system was implemented. Only the person who stood at the end would receive the highest honor of the academy, the title of Champion Knight. And after the Champion Knight was decided, the best knight of each year would be selected based on the points. Basically, these people could be branded with the mark of nobility. Even though this system was not very fair, but it was a true reflection of the life and death struggle on the battlefield. Just like a famous quote from the founder of the academy, "Luck is not only your strength, but it is also one of your greatest reliance." This sentence was the most appropriate to describe Freya. She was only an iron-ranked, and this speed of improvement was considered rare for a normal person. It could be said that it was the greatest affirmation of her hard work, but in this situation, Freya felt that she did not have any extra strength to react to her opponent's movements. She could only barely keep up with the other party's circling movements and pray that luck would favor her, or perhaps a miracle would be more appropriate at this moment. Her opponent seemed to have noticed this as well. After carefully confirming that she was not deliberately deceiving him, the senior student decisively launched an attack. The sword came from the back of her right side, which was the hardest to guard against. Freya did not think much of it, or rather she did not have the strength to think much. She raised her sword. It was almost an instinctive action, but as if she had a mind of her own, she let the opponent's sword pass through the handle of her long sword. She felt a burning sensation on her hand, and her opponent was slightly stunned. Freya did not even think about it and twisted her hand, pulling the sword from the handle of the cage. While he was still in a daze, she went up to him and elbowed him in the chest. The student was sent flying, but when he got up again, Freya's sword was already on his neck. "What kind of swordsmanship is that?" the student asked as he got up. He saw the bright red blood dripping down from the girl's hand, and it was somewhat dazzling. Freya did not answer. In fact, she was a little confused. The last move she used just now was obviously a move that she remembered Brando had used before. When she first saw Brando use it, she did not think it was very exquisite, but now that she thought about it, it was very practical. But she thought that if it was Brando who used it, she would not have hurt her hand. "I admit defeat." The senior student who was sitting on the ground was stunned for a moment, and finally raised his hand. Then Freya saw the female knight, who was the referee, walk in. As usual, the latter separated the two with a cold face, and then turned to look at her. "I heard that you have been on the battlefield?" Maynard asked in a cold voice. Freya noticed that there was a trace of deep suspicion in her eyes. She rarely saw unnecessary emotions in those dark eyes, as if the female knight was always wearing a cold mask. But at this moment the mask was a little loose. The girl was a little confused, but she still nodded. In the Royal Cavalry Academy, there was no one who dared to go against this senior. "Is it related to Madara's undead?" "Yes." "The swordsmanship you used just now, can you still use it again?" Freya hesitated for a moment. She felt that she was about to faint. But Maynard also saw her embarrassment and did not insist. Instead, she said, "That move just now had the shadow of Erwin's military swordsmanship, and it was not the same as the knight's swordsmanship taught in the academy. I heard that you were once a militia?" Freya nodded again. "But no matter if it is the militia's swordsmanship or the guard's swordsmanship, it is not a straightforward killing move. It is more like the real Erwin's swordsmanship." The black-haired female knight frowned and looked at her deeply. "You are from Wuxia? Do you know anyone in the White Mane Army?" Freya was stunned. She did not know why this senior who usually took care of her would keep asking her these strange questions. Of course she shook her head. But the current Freya was no longer the ignorant country girl from Wuxia. She had gained a lot of knowledge after studying for a few months. She recalled the move just now, and the swordsmanship Brando used. It seemed that they all had one thing in common. To put it simply, it was concise. It was an extremely concise swordsmanship, as if it did not need any extra moves, as if it was purely used to win. Freya could imagine the effect of this swordsmanship on the battlefield. No wonder Maynard called it a killing move. She recalled that Brendel's every move was swift and clean, and his speed was astonishing. But when she came back to her senses, she saw Maynard's pair of dark eyes staring at her. She was shocked. She had never seen this side of Maynard. But after a while, Maynard said, "Actually, that was not a pure Erwin battle formation swordsmanship." Freya was stunned. Her heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? "Are you hiding something, Freya?" The girl quickly shook her head, causing her ponytail to sway. "Alright, that was a modified version of Erwin battle formation swordsmanship." Maynard straightened her body and said with a strange expression, "I've seen this swordsmanship before." Freya watched as Maynard turned around and walked to the other side of the arena after she finished speaking. However, her face slowly turned pale. She suddenly thought of a possibility. This woman knew Brando. Who was that? The half-fairy princess turned around. Who? The student who won just now. Magadol looked at the crowd below and said, "I saw Maynard talking to her for a while. She seemed to be a girl." Griffine followed Magadal's gaze and understood. That's Everton's daughter. The silver-haired girl sighed. Unfortunately, it seems that she did not inherit her father's talent. Although she is already very good, she is not the best in this batch of students. Compared to her father, she is still far behind. Griffine, that's because the quality of this batch of students is too good. Although the nun princess was not an expert in swordsmanship, her wisdom and experience made up for the gap. That young man called Breton and the other two people, I've heard you mention them more than once. Chapter 278. Along the banks of the Gree River, the sky was gradually brightening. In the forest, Rabin and the night-song tiger were hiding under the bushes, silently watching the noble's army pass through the forest noisily. This was not surprising, as even the regular army of the kingdom could not achieve such a high level of discipline. Of course, mercenaries were much better. At least they had the awareness of being ambushers. Hundreds of mercenaries were holding their breaths and hiding along the banks of the Gree River, waiting for the last noble soldier to enter the predetermined battlefield. Hundreds of crossbows, long and short bows, were about to aim at the prey that was entering their shooting range. Although these guys don't seem to be very strong, the night-song tiger said as he looked out of the forest, but these scouts are still very experienced, they just lack some combat experience. The leader of the Fire-Ground Corps glanced at the man beside him. He knew that this man did not have a name, only a nickname. He had never heard of the night-song bird before. You only lack a little combat experience? You're the only one who dares to say that. Rabin couldn't help but think. As a former captain of Karsuk's cavalry, Rabin was much more knowledgeable than the average person. He was well aware that Maxon's scouts were top-notch even in the regular army. However, this man and his mercenaries were too powerful. He saw with his own eyes how the mercenaries of Lopez killed a group of nobles' scouts. They leaped up, mounted their horses, killed them, and threw away the corpses in one go. The corpses of the noble scouts were still lying in the forest, with only their body temperature left. However, the dead could not stand up and complain about the words of the mercenary leader. The former captain of the cavalry could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. That level of courage and tacit cooperation made him wonder if these guys were really mercenaries. And this guy was only the young lord's servant. He probably wasn't even a knight. Of course, Rabin could not guess who Brando was, but that did not stop him from making a judgment. As a veteran captain of the cavalry, he was more observant than most people when it came to details. When Brando captured Grodin, he already knew that this young man was extraordinary before Yuta and Cornelius. At the same time, he was also the first to suspect Brando's intentions. A noble like Brando did not need to come to such a remote place, right? So what was his purpose? Rabin might seem like a careless person, but he was keenly aware of Brando's ambitions, which was why he sided with him from the start. After leaving Karsuk's cavalry, he worked tirelessly to establish this mercenary group. Of course, he was not someone who was willing to be ordinary. Rabin had been looking for someone to serve among the nobles for a long time, but most of the time, the people he looked up to would look down on him. Most of the people who looked up to him were people like Grodin, who was despised by the nobles. That was until Brando presented him with this opportunity. The two of them hit it off immediately. While Rabin was lost in his thoughts, the nobles' army slowly entered the forest. After crossing the Gree River, Lord Menta slowed down. Although it seemed like the rioters did not stay behind, he was a cautious person. There was nothing wrong with being careful. However, this cautiousness did not come from his innate sensitivity towards war and military matters, but from his personality. That was why when his youngest son caught up to him, Lord Maxon still had his mercenaries and private soldiers move forward through the forest by the riverside. The noises made by the soldiers along the way annoyed him. However, there was no point in restraining them. At most he could only control them for a while. Instead, he looked at the knights around him and felt a little satisfied. These knights were his old subordinates and were truly seasoned warriors. Even though they were covered in armor, their calm eyes were constantly observing the surrounding forest under their masks. They always held their swords and maintained the necessary vigilance. A true knight was a professional soldier who had practiced the art of war for a long time. Naturally, they were different from others. Even their attendants, the noble soldiers who followed behind the gigantic dragon mounts and waved various banners, seemed to be better trained than the mercenaries. But that was just how it looked. Lord Maxon instinctively frowned when the group entered the narrow path between the forests. But just as he was thinking about whether they would encounter any trouble, the sound of horses galloping could be heard from behind him. There were only his second son's men at the back of the group. He had personally assigned them to him. There were a total of 50 men, and he thought that it would be enough for him to deal with them for a while. However, he didn't expect that the other party would be able to make these people obedient. This was beyond his expectations. What new tricks did that kid come up with? With that thought in mind, Lord Maxon turned around and saw the familiar face that made the corners of his eyes twitch as he chased after him on horseback with a few men behind him. Samuel loved and hated his son at the same time. When Carglass approached the group, he pulled on the reins and slowed the horse down. The young man stood upright on the horse in the most standard knight posture, like a straight sharp knife. He casually pushed the messy hair on his forehead to the side and let out a sigh. "Father, what's wrong?" The young man smiled shyly and asked, "Father, how long has it been since the scouts came back?" Lord Maxon was startled as he realized the problem. However, he did not want to admit it and asked in a displeased tone, "Why do you ask? They're only a little late. They might have gone too far. You know that my men always have too much energy." Carglass raised his head and glanced at the forest. "Not necessarily," he said casually. "You little bastard." Lord Maxon cursed in his heart. "What are you trying to say?" Carglass couldn't help but chuckle as he stared at his father with a strange expression. Everyone says that Lord Maxon is a cautious person, but that's not necessarily the case. Before he could finish his sentence, he noticed that Maxon's expression was getting darker and darker. "But father, aren't you a little too bold? You knew that there was a problem with the scouts, but you still allowed the army to enter the forest?" Carglass quickly changed his words. Although that was what he said, he didn't seem to be worried at all. After all, their opponents were just a bunch of rioters. No matter how strong they were just a bunch of mobs. The young man thought highly of himself and naturally did not put Brando's mercenaries in his eyes. Of course, if he knew what kind of danger was lurking in the forest, he would not think that way. "Since when did you have the right to lecture an old man like me?" Lord Maxon interrupted him. "You weren't even born when I was fighting." Yes, father. Let's stop the army first." Lord Maxon looked around and was a little worried. But at least he found a way out. He raised his hand and the messenger immediately passed down his order. After a short commotion, the army stopped. But once they stopped, Carglass immediately noticed that something was wrong before the experienced knight. He raised his head and looked into the forest, frowning deeply. It was not only him. When the young man smelled that something was wrong, the other knight present also sensed that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Rabin also frowned. That noble had stopped outside the ambush circle. If he had just a little bit more time, he could have taken the initiative to attack. But this matter was suddenly suspended in the air. He took a deep breath and stared at every detail outside the forest. After some thought, he decided to wait a little longer. In his career as a Karsuk knight, Rabin learned that he had to remain calm on the battlefield. This was how he could see the situation clearly and win the final victory. But this time he was wrong. The Nightsong Tiger also stared in that direction. He had already sensed that something was wrong. It was not normal for the noble's army to stop as soon as the horsemen entered the group. He first suspected that the enemy had discovered their presence. But whether or not the enemy had discovered them, he knew that he had to make a decision. The subterranean dwellers were about 100 meters away from the noble's army. They were equipped with the 4-armed crossbows given to them by the humans for the first time. Tajev had always wanted these weapons, but Grodin was not foolish enough to hand them over to his enemies. Of course, it was a different story when they joined Brando's group. 100 meters was a long distance for a human. Even an iron-ranked warrior would need a few seconds to cross this distance, let alone in the forest. But it was enough for the subterranean dwellers. The Nightsong Tiger made a decision. "Send the signal," he ordered in a deep voice. "Wait," Rabin was puzzled. "The distance is too far. They haven't entered our ambush yet." We have the absolute advantage in numbers and strength. The ambush is just icing on the cake, the Nightsong Tiger answered decisively. But if we wait for them to react, the situation will be out of our control. My lord wants to capture that knight. That is the main point of this battle. The Nightsong Tiger continued. Rabin was stunned for a moment before he understood. It was indeed so. P.S. As Long Kong's hooligan student wishes. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 279. Retreat. Karglai stared into the forest, his expression turning serious. What? Lord Maxon could not believe his ears. His youngest son actually wanted him to retreat. Even though it was fine to be cautious, wasn't this making a mountain out of a molehill? What would happen to his father's reputation? Brat, this old man isn't dead yet. It's not your turn to command. Lord Maxon coughed sternly and reprimanded Karglais. My lord, I'm afraid the young master is right. At this moment, the knight beside him spoke with a grave expression. It's best if we retreat. What's going on? Lord Maxon was stunned. His old subordinates would not joke about him. This time even he started to panic. But just as he finished speaking, everyone heard a shrill cry coming from the forest. The young man subconsciously raised his head and saw a conspicuous magic signal slowly rising in the air. Good heavens, are they really rioters? This was the only thought in Karglai's mind. A day and a night had passed since they left Abes. Beyond the blue-black peaks, the party stood on the summit, and the view extended in all directions with the earth. The fields formed a green-checkered rag, which stretched away through the winding valleys. Brando did not expect Mount Greyhar to have such a scenery, and could not help but be startled. That's Schaflund. Jana looked down the mountain path. Red roofs dotted the forest like stars in the sky. They gradually became denser, forming a settlement. The small town was sleeping peacefully in the mountains. It was close to noon, but they had already arrived. Although Seal's words before he left opened up a whole new line of thought for Brendel. As a free trade port, Ampere Seal was a place full of gold. And he didn't only have Ramona in his hands. Not only did he have Ramona's paintings, but he also had a future master alchemist. Coupled with the experience he brought from the game, it would not be difficult for him to earn a bucket of gold from the free trade port. Even though he had to go to Ampere Seal, Schaflund's silver mine was also a long-term matter. Thus, Brando did not change his plans and came to this mining town in the mountains. How beautiful! Scarlet muttered when she saw this scene from behind. At this moment, the bushes behind them rustled as mercenaries came out of the forest one after another. There were a total of 27 of them, each of them steady as they looked around with sharp eyes. These people were all at least at the peak of iron rank, and they were all elites under Yuta's command. In order to gather enough people, the female mercenary leader had even borrowed quite a few people from other small mercenary groups. To be honest, Brendel was taken aback when he saw them. The peak of the iron rank was already at the threshold of the silver rank. These people only needed to be trained a little, and they could become masters of their own. Even a well-trained knight could not compare to them. But compared to his own luxurious lineup, these people paled in comparison. Not to mention Brando himself, everyone here knew that the two girls beside the young lord were golden warriors. There were also two silent attendants. They were actually angels, but their snow-white wings were too eye-catching, so Brando asked them to keep them. They were also lower silver rank. To Brando, it was too wasteful to summon holy angels after shuffling them into his deck. Although he did not have a lot of cards in his deck, it was still easy to draw this card. However, Brando did not have an effective way to replenish his light EP, so he simply left the two angels outside. He would rather spend 1 light EP per day since he did not need to use the resurrection cards for the time being. He was thinking of throwing the two angels back when he only had 5 light EP left. It would be enough to leave one chance for him to resurrect the angels. The 100 wealth he saved when he subdued the subterranean dwellers could finally be used to unseal the fire elemental land card, Ember Volcano, and the wind elemental land card, Nest of Storms. At this moment, an extinguished volcano and the eye of the storm that was constantly spinning in the sky were already lying quietly in the independent space he created with his mind. The only land card left in the card book was the Fire Elemental land card, the Wasteland of Caradu. With the Wind Elemental land card, summoning the Wind Spirit Spiders was no longer a burden. The Fire Elemental land card allowed him to aim for a card in the deck. Fire Djinn, Scorching Hell X, 15 Fire EP creature. Elemental Djinn, level 36 creature tap. Let the Fire Djinn deal great damage to your enemy and shuffle it back into the deck. When the Fire Djinn is on the field, pay 2 Fire EP per day. On the Scorching Earth, the Fire Djinn always makes its enemies tremble in fear. Purchase requirement. Pay 50 Fire EP. The purchase of this card required Fire EP and not wealth. This was extremely attractive to Brando, who urgently needed wealth to unseal the resource cards of fate. Although 50 Fire EP was a little too much for Brando's Fire EP pool, which only had 37 slots, it did not matter. As an elementalist who leaned towards the fire element, all he needed to do was to practice his fire element spells and his Fire EP pool would slowly expand. Fortunately, when he was leveling up his elementalist, the initial spells he chose were all fire element spells. Fire Arrow and the like did not consume too much of his mana. Apart from that, another card that he had planned for a long time entered his vision. Silver Swallowtail Flag, Guild of Light 712 Earth or Water Treasure Fantasy Wonder. When the Silver Swallowtail Flag is on the field, all creatures on the field have their upkeep costs reduced by 1. If there are multiple upkeep costs, choose one of them. Tap to select a card and double the amount of wealth it produces. Flowing Silver. Purchase requirement. Pay 100 wealth. Brendel had been drooling over this card for a long time, and he even hesitated for a long time on whether it was the land card or this card. It was only when the Shire gave him a suggestion that he made up his mind. No matter what, a Planeswalker's power was based on the Earth cards. What are we going to do next? Scarlet rested her halberd on her shoulder and looked back at Brendel. Brendel could not help but worry that the girl's small shoulders would not be able to bear the weight. Before Brando could say anything, the mercenary leader spoke first. Shaflund is a small town that developed because of the silver mines. Most of the people living here are miners. The prosperity here is based on the basic necessities of the miners. There are many shops and inns in the town. There are inns in a place like this? The red-haired girl interrupted her. It's not strange. Shaflund is also the furthest place in the Greyhar Mountains. There are many adventurers who visit this place. It's rumored that there is an open-air silver mine in the forest. Many people who come here dream of getting rich. An open-air silver mine. The Roman's voice came from behind them. Is there really such a thing? Everyone turned around and saw Romaine was the last one to come out from the bushes. She was still holding onto her skirt to prevent it from getting caught on a branch. But this time she did not come out alone. Brando had asked her to come with him. There were many accounts in Shaflund's silver mine. It was good that she was self-taught. Other than Amandina, only the Roman knew how to read these accounts. It is said that there is an open-air silver mine in the forest. Some people have seen it before, and some have even made a fortune from it. But that is only a small number of people. Most people return empty-handed. Yuta replied. Even so, there are still so many people coming here? Scarlet was puzzled. I heard that there are several inns here. People will only see a small number of successful cases. Brando looked down at Shaflund and continued. Even though Yuta felt that the grammar of Brendel's words was a little strange, she had to agree that it was the truth. She nodded. My lord is right. What's more, those adventurers who made a fortune just threw their money on the gambling table, and lost it all in the blink of an eye. Things that come easily will be thrown away easily. Medisha's voice was soft and gentle. She used an ancient elven proverb to describe the situation. Everyone couldn't help but nod in agreement. But the Roman expressed a different opinion. If there are people who made a fortune from this, then it must be real, right? She seemed to be unable to forget about the open-air silver mine. My aunt always said that a man's wealth is his own ruin. This kind of thing will definitely attract the attention of the nobles, right? Even Count Ranner's subordinates would be tempted by the open-air silver mine. But no one who discovered the open-air silver mine went into the forest to find the vein. Yuta shook her head. This is also the mysterious part of the forest. The Roman's eyes widened. It was obvious that she was extremely curious about this matter. Scarlet swung her flame-like ponytail and pouted. Gods and ghosts, most of them are fake. Those who made a fortune might not necessarily have discovered the open-air silver mine. Maybe it's just a rumor. That's a possibility. Brando thought of another possibility, but he intended to return to the main topic. But let's talk about our plan first. Yuta, you're the most familiar with this place. Tell me what you think. My lord, 2 miles northeast of Schaflund is the mining area. Every morning, the workers will go through a specially open mountain path to enter the mining area. There are many towers along this path, and there are also light cavalry patrolling the area. It's impossible for us to walk in openly. Is that the only way? Brando asked. With our skills, how likely is it that we can sneak in through the mountains? It's not impossible, Yuta thought for a moment. But I heard that the guard captain of the mining area is a gold-rank swordsman. Brando nodded. It would be strange if there's no expert in this place. After all, the highest defense officer in the mining area is a sword saint who has awakened his elemental energy. That's good, he replied. Compared to the heavily guarded mining area, entering Schaflund isn't a difficult task. There are quite a lot of people here, so we won't attract too much attention if we split up and enter separately. Everyone, remember to bring your own funds and check in at the inn. Brando looked at the sky. We'll gather again in the evening. Have you memorized the marks we agreed on? Everyone nodded in agreement. Then let's move out. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 280. In the center of Schaflund, there was a tavern called Forest Trout. The owner of the tavern was an ordinary middle-aged man, but the ale sold there tasted really good and attracted a lot of regular customers. Most of them were local workmen who worked 6 days a week and could come back to town on Sundays to relax. Workmen from the mines, stinking of sweat, invariably boisterous, and without exception rude and loud, heedless of what other people thought of them, commenting in small groups on the figure of some waitress. If any of the waitresses in the tavern gave them a flirtatious look, they would definitely be booed. But there were a few youths drinking in the corner of the tavern, looking at them from the corner of their eyes while discussing their own matters. Most of them were born here, their parents were workers in the mines and so were they. But the restlessness of youths made them unwilling to spend the rest of their lives in this place. They discussed with each other and decided to leave this place and explore the outside world. But they were born in this town, and the furthest they went was the nearby forest. At most, they could only guess what the outside world was like from the words of the adventurers outside. The youths discussed for a while, and just as they were about to set a time, they heard a cold snort coming from beside them. The young people were slightly startled and turned their heads guiltily. They saw an old dwarf sitting at another table not far away. Just like in most fantasy stories, this old dwarf had a conspicuous big nose and a long beard that reached below his waist. His hair was braided and tied with an iron ring, and his arms and legs were very thick and strong. But his skin wasn't the healthy reddish-brown of the hill dwarfs. Instead, it was a light gray color. The young man's expression changed when he saw the dwarf. This old man was called Odom, and they didn't know where he came from. However, it was said that he was very capable, and had gotten a job as a steward for the chief of this place. But his temper was really bad. He was stubborn and inflexible, and he never gave anyone a good face. His situation wasn't very good either. He was often seen drinking alone. Even though dwarves loved to drink, they rarely drank alone. Unlike this old dwarf, his temper would get worse after drinking, and he would keep a straight face and ignore everyone. Furthermore, this fellow was extremely arrogant and looked down on everyone. Someone had once heard him speak ill of the scribe. However, this old dwarf was so angry that he even dared to scold the king, so this matter didn't attract much attention. When the young man saw that it was him, he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. "Old Odom, so you're here?" One of the more quick-witted ones quickly said in a friendly tone. The old dwarf glanced at the young people and asked, "What's wrong? Are we bothering you?" No. The person who reacted quickly immediately said, "How could that be? We want to treat you to a drink, but—" The old dwarf snorted and said, "Who cares about your stupid business? But let me remind you, young man, the outside world is not so simple. Be careful not to bump your head and come back bleeding. The few youngsters immediately felt as if they had been granted amnesty. They stammered in response, and then went to pay the bill in a hustle and bustle, and hurriedly left through the front door. When they left, they couldn't help but curse their bad luck. Why did they meet this old man? Fortunately, he didn't have a good relationship with most of the people in town, or else he would have run over and told their parents, and they would probably be beaten up badly. The old dwarf shook his head as he watched the young people leave. The outside world was not that easy to explore, but the young people were hot-blooded, so he did not care about these things. Just as the old dwarf was about to lower his head and drink some wine, he was startled. He saw 3 men and 4 women walking in from outside the inn. In fact, when Brando opened the door and entered, everyone's eyes lit up. What a beautiful girl! Medisha was a pure-blooded silver elf royalty, and her beauty was self-evident. Although her body hadn't fully matured, and she had a delicate temperament, she attracted the attention of others. Roman and Scarlet were not to be outdone either. The merchant girl always had a unique temperament that made people want to take a second look at her, and her pair of dark eyes played an important role. Moreover, her hands were placed on the leather bag in front of her chest, and the way she looked around made people have a good impression of her. Scarlet's amber eyes were like burning flames that attracted people's attention. When the girl entered the bar, she couldn't help but frown slightly. The tip of her eyebrows raised, and there was a dangerous aura about her that kept people away. The lightning spear was disassembled into 3 parts and tied to her back. The girl raised her head slightly, letting her long red ponytail hang behind her back. She looked around with a vigilant expression. However, the one who caused a commotion among the guests was Yuta, who didn't stand out as much in terms of appearance. The female mercenary group leader's tall and voluptuous figure caused everyone to subconsciously whistle when she entered the hall. A few gazes even landed on the group leader's towering chest. Yuta didn't mind and only snorted coldly. Brando couldn't help but chuckle. He had often seen such a scene in fantastical stories. It could even be said that the various inns were one of the most important places in such stories. Adventurers discussed their plans in low voices, rude guests played drinking games, and the sound of flirting with the barmaids could be heard. It would be perfect if there was a poet. With such unrealistic thoughts in mind, Brando turned around. The owner of the bar was already waiting for him. He was just an ordinary middle-aged man, but from the looks of it, he could already see the hierarchy of the group. When the men, whose lower body dictated their thoughts, looked at the women, the middle-aged man paid more attention to the details of the temperament that exuded from Brando's group. Although the 2 angelic attendants behind the young men had picturesque features, the middle-aged man's gaze didn't linger on them for long. As the owner of this crowded bar, he had long been trained to see people differently from the average person, especially the confidence of a modern person in Brando. He was very similar to the descendants of nobles who were born in prominent families and had received good education since young. Therefore, the middle-aged man could tell the young man apart from the others at a glance. This is a noble young master, the owner of the bar thought. He forced a smile on his face and unconsciously spoke in a more respectful tone. Is there anything I can help you with? Brando looked up and saw a wooden board with the types of wine for sale hanging in front of the wine rack. He pointed at the most expensive wine on the board and ordered a glass. Of course, Brando wasn't interested in the wine. He was just putting on an act. Other than Medisha, the other ladies ordered a fruit wine that was slightly sweet and slightly sour. Spirits didn't need to eat, so the silver fairy princess just stood quietly behind them. Scarlet noticed her and whispered, "Can't you eat?" Medisha was taken aback and shook her head. "It's just not necessary." "Then let's try it." The girl fiddled with her long ponytail. "If we don't order anything here, we'll be too conspicuous." "No," Roman's voice cut in and said seriously, "a real lady won't eat anything in a messy place like this." Scarlet saw the merchant girl holding a glass of fruit wine with both hands and rolled her eyes. "Aren't you drinking too?" she asked in annoyance. "I'm not a lady to begin with." Roman widened her eyes and answered matter-of-factly. When Medisa heard the conversation between the two, she could only chuckle to herself. As for the 2 angelic attendants, they ignored the chatter of the girls and followed behind Brando expressionlessly. This allowed the middle-aged man to confirm who was the female companion, and who was the attendant. He looked at the few of them and asked with the keen eyes of a businessman, "Are you from the outside?" Scarlett stopped and raised her eyebrows alertly. Brando knew that there was nothing to hide. Although these people were not local, they had seen a lot of people in the town. They might know all the locals in the town, so deliberately hiding it would only make them suspicious. He simply nodded. "Let's try our luck." Brando didn't tell the truth. The middle-aged man thought that they might be the children of a noble who left home to play. This kind of person was not uncommon in Erewhon, but they were usually the descendants of nobles with a certain amount of family background. "So you're going into the forest, do you need a guide?" He thought for a moment and asked. "The service is very good." Brando thought that the glass of the most expensive wine in his hand was effective. A place like this was a place where information was circulated, and the owner often sold information on the side. However, most of the information was based on hearsay, and there was no way to determine whether it was true or false. The only good thing was that the price was also included in the cost of the wine. "I won't charge you an extra cent." Brando ordered the most expensive wine in the restaurant, and the middle-aged man was naturally very attentive. However, Brando still shook his head. "I don't need a guide, but I want to ask, what's the situation in the forest? The town's surroundings are not dangerous, but you will encounter wild beasts and possibly monsters if you go deep into the forest." The middle-aged man replied. "Also, there's a mining area to the north. If you go that way, you might encounter patrols from the mining area. It won't be good if you're caught as someone with bad intentions." As if afraid that the young man would not know the immensity of heaven and earth, he hurriedly added, "Although this is Tonagel's territory, the owner of the mining area is actually Count Randner." "Oh," Brendel said. He lowered his head and took a sip of the wine. The spicy taste went straight from his tongue to his throat, and then back into his nose. The young man almost coughed violently. Brando frowned. He was not a good drinker, and it was not a wise choice to pretend to be like this. With great difficulty, he suppressed the taste in his mouth. He had already made up his mind not to touch this thing in the slightest. At the same time, he raised his head and asked in a roundabout manner, "Since that's the case, what places should I avoid?" "Don't go north," the innkeeper replied. "As long as you don't go north, there won't be any trouble. But if I don't go north, how will I find the legendary open-air silver mine?" Brando purposely frowned. The middle-aged man glanced at him and thought, "As expected, he's here for this." Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation, P.S. Recently, there have been Doomsday Cult followers roaming the book review section again. Chapter 281. "That's hard to say." The innkeeper lowered his body and whispered to them, "But if you don't lack money, you can try looking for a few famous adventurers. Those adventurers have been to the forest many times and have even drawn a map of the area." "A map? It's worth a lot." Brando nodded and asked about the local situation. It was mainly about the work and rest of the workers, as well as the patrol time of the soldiers in the mining area. Of course, he was pretending to be an adventurer. As for the owner of the inn, he saw him as a noble who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth and only wanted to have fun. Both of them did not mind the misunderstanding, and the conversation went on harmoniously. Brando did not waste much of his time. After a short while, he turned around and saw that the ladies had found a seat in the hall. Brando looked at them and was about to walk over, but he stopped. A dwarf stood in front of him. "Please make way." The drunk Odom squinted his small eyes and could barely see the young man in front of him. He thought that it was the one who came in earlier, but that was not important. He just wanted to know, what was the purpose of this person blocking his way? The old dwarf shook his head and wanted to figure it out, but Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. It was as if the road was 10 feet wide, but the damn dwarf insisted on standing in front of him and saying that he was blocking his way. But he did not have the time to cause trouble here, so he hesitated for a while and stepped aside. But at this moment Brando was stunned. The dwarf's face was red, and Brando thought that he was just a common hill dwarf. But after looking at him for a while, Brando noticed that the dwarf's skin was light gray. The young man's heart thumped heavily. A rune dwarf. He almost thought that he was still asleep and wanted to pinch his cheeks to confirm whether he was drunk or the dwarf was drunk. The rune dwarves were not as prominent as the silver elves in Wone's history. They came from the underground of Jorgendy Ridge, just like the cavemen. But they were different from the ordinary people of the underground. They were the silver folk that had disappeared long ago. Legend has it that the rune dwarves were wiped out in the war before the end of the Age of Chaos. Another legend said that the rune dwarves had a city on the other side of the Mercury Sea. But no matter which one it was, Brando did not expect to see a living rune dwarf here. That's right, their light gray skin was their most prominent feature. Other than that, there were no other dwarves in the world with such skin color. These dwarves from the Silver Age were the builders of the Steel Plains. Their architectural skills were on par with the craftsmen of Buga during the Age of Chaos. However, the rune dwarves were not satisfied with this evaluation. It was just that one of their creations was on the ground while the other was in the sky. They had never had the chance to compete. But Brando calmed down after a short moment of shock. Brando knew that no matter what the characteristics were, there would always be some adventurous and wandering tribes. However, most of these descendants had more or less inherited the similarities in their bloodline. As for how much of their cultural heritage was left, only the heavens knew. There were actually quite a number of ancient descendants in Vaunt, but many of them did not even know their own origins. For example, if Brando had not seen the description of the rune dwarf, he would not have recognized the drunken dwarf. But just as he was thinking about it, Odom had already shakily brushed past him. Brendel turned around and saw the old dwarf parting the crowd and walking away, leaving only his back view. Brando thought for a while and did not immediately follow him. There was nothing to talk about with a drunken dwarf. Moreover, the dwarf seemed to be a worker here, so he would not disappear from the face of the earth anytime soon. His goal was to take control of the silver mine, and it would be much better to interact with the dwarf then. But even so, he still turned around and asked the middle-aged man, "Who is that?" "An old man, I think his name is Odom. He's been here for a while now." The middle-aged man did not know why the young noble was interested in the unkempt dwarf. "He's a miner in the mine." "What does he do?" "Overseer." "Have you heard of his specialty? For example, construction?" Brando asked further. The middle-aged man was stunned and shook his head. "I have not heard of him." "Oh, I thought the dwarves were all experts in construction." Brando laughed and purposely said so. "That must be the mountain dwarves from the north, my guest." Brando nodded and put the matter aside. He then turned around and walked back to the table where the ladies were. When he approached, the Roman and Medicia were chatting about something, but they stopped at the same time and looked at the young lord. "What's wrong?" Yuta asked. "Nothing," Brando shook his head. "But I have asked around and the situation is not good." "What happened?" Yuta's eyes flashed with a hint of worry. Other than Brando, she was the only one who cared about the success or failure of this matter. "We thought that the workers would go in and out of the mine every day, but I just heard that is not the case," Brando said in a low voice. "In fact, the workers are only in town for 1 day a week. Every Monday morning, they will return to the mine and will only leave after Saturday. The other party is very strict with the management of the workers. Yes, the chances of us fishing in troubled waters is small," Brando said. "What's the problem?" Scarlet asked, puzzled. 2 points. It is not difficult to take control of the mine. We just need to kill the intermediate gold-rank swordsman. The remaining 100 or so people will not be enough. However, it is a little troublesome to do it quietly and not attract the attention of Lord Paulus. But me, my lord, and Princess Medicia, will there be any problem for the 3 of us to deal with the intermediate gold-rank swordsman? The red-haired girl frowned and asked. "Of course not, but you should know how big the commotion caused by a fight between gold-rank swordsmen is," Brando replied. "As long as one person knows that the mine is under attack, the news will spread like wildfire. In a few days, Lord Paulus will know more about this matter than we do. We can seal the news," Roman suggested. "Lord Paulus is not a fool. If there is no news from Shaftalin for a long time, he will be suspicious. The only thing we can do is to control this place and make it work as usual, and secretly send silver to Ferber." Brendel shook his head. Brando did not finish his sentence, but everyone knew what was going to happen next. The silver would be secretly sent to the mint and made into private coins. This was a secret that the local lords did not need to disclose. In fact, before they left, Brando had already asked the county to search for a secret mint that Grodin might be hiding in a manor outside Abbey's. In fact, these were all things that could lead to the gallows, but as Brando often said, a death row criminal would not care if there was 1 or 2 nooses around his neck. Scarlet was startled for a moment, then slowly nodded in understanding. Can't we lure him out? Or take action when he is outside? That human can't stay in the mine forever, right? The Silver Fairy Princess suggested in a soft voice. We can, but if he doesn't come out once a month, won't we have to wait here for a month? Brando shook his head. That's why we have to take the initiative and sneak into the mine to find out his movements. Besides, if we want to control the mine, our men will have to infiltrate it sooner or later. Medisha nodded in agreement. Then what should we do, my lord? Yuta asked softly. Shh, don't call me my lord here. Brando looked around and said. Actually, I've not only heard bad news but also 2 good news. This time, no one interrupted, as if they were waiting for him to continue. The first news is that the adventurers in the vicinity might have secretly made a map of the mine. I think this news is very likely to be true. From what I know, adventurers often do this kind of thing. Yes, young master. The mercenary leader saw Brando's gaze and hurriedly corrected herself. Sometimes the adventurers would even work together with the local bandits. The nobles usually turn a blind eye to this kind of thing since they won't do anything anyway. And the second news? Romaine asked curiously. I heard that the adventurers here would occasionally work in the mines for a period of time. You should know that adventurers don't always have the means to support themselves. Yuta was startled when she heard the news. The nobles are willing to let these troublemakers into the mines. Why wouldn't they? The mines need labor. They're not allowed to bring weapons into the mines, and they're not allowed to leave with even a piece of ore. The mines are used to exchange ores for money and food. What can these adventurers do? Besides, this is Count Randner's territory. Other than us, who else would cause trouble? Brando asked in a low voice. Then can't we sneak in? Romaine's eyes lit up. You can't, but I can. There are others who can too. Brando shook his head. The mines don't take in women, or else the world will be in chaos. They looked at each other and saw the feasibility of the plan in each other's eyes. If they could sneak into the mines as workers, then it would be easy to find out the movements of the guards. But how should they do it? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 282. The entrance to the mine was bustling with activity. Be it workers or adventurers, all of them entered the mine in an orderly manner under the watchful eyes of a group of cavalrymen. In order to speed up the process, the crowd formed 3 columns. Brando glanced at the map in his hand and silently memorized the terrain and markings on it. He then folded the parchment and kept it in his bosom. He raised his head and looked at the group in front of him. More than 20 mercenaries had successfully infiltrated the mine, and the cavalrymen patrolling the entrance were not very vigilant. This was probably because Schaflund had been peaceful for too long. Even if there were bandits harassing Tanajul, these outlaws rarely dared to enter the mine. On one hand, they were afraid of Count Randner's reputation, and on the other hand, the losses outweighed the gains. Brando's gaze landed on the lush forest. Scarlet, Medisha, and Yuta might have already infiltrated the mine. Even the weakest of them was at least a silver-ranked warrior, and it would not be difficult for them to avoid the attention of the soldiers on the tower. The Roman was left behind in Schaflund, and there were 2 holy angels protecting him. At the very least, he would not be too worried. Then, Brando heard the cavalryman in front of him shouting, "Next!" The cavalryman's voice carried a strong local accent, and he knew it was his turn. They hurriedly lowered their heads and walked forward. At first, they thought that the other party would at least make a show of searching them, but they didn't expect that the cavalrymen wearing bright silver-pointed helmets would let them pass after sweeping their gaze over their heads and seeing that no one was carrying any weapons. If I knew this would happen, maybe Yuta and the others could have disguised themselves as men and sneaked in. Brando shook his head and thought to himself, but it seems like the silver-rank swordsman's vigilance is not that high. This is good news. After passing the sentry post, the surveillance became more relaxed. Brando looked around and quickly identified the mercenaries in disguise. Of course, the so-called disguise meant that they did not bring any weapons. Of course, he did not immediately rush forward to meet up with his men. Although it wasn't that adventurers didn't travel in groups, their group of more than 20 people was enough to arouse suspicion. Moreover, everyone had left a way to contact each other, so there was no rush. Brando had completed all sorts of quests in the Amber Sword, but he had never gone deep into enemy territory in disguise. For a moment he couldn't help but feel a little nervous and inexplicably excited. But when he remembered that he was a gold-ranked level 1 player, he subconsciously calmed down a little. Yes, although in the past game, it was a wound where gold was as plentiful as dogs and elements were everywhere. But now, it was only the end of the year of flowers and summer leaves. The War of the Black Roses, which had begun and ended in a hurry this year, had just ignited the flames of war on the land. In this year, there were probably only a few who had the strength of a gold ranker before the age of 20. Brando looked to the side, silently observing the surrounding terrain, as if he was admiring the scenery. Between Schaflund and the mines, there was only a narrow, winding path through the forest. Occasionally, one could see the rolling hills of Greyhill Hill towards Trentheim, beyond the trees halfway up the hill. It was as if a watercolor had been drawn out on a green canvas, and the trees were like mottled ink dots, sprinkled over the mountain range. It was very pleasing to the eye. He raised his hand again, and looked at the unfamiliar patterns growing on his palm. For a moment, he couldn't help but feel a little absent-minded. It seemed like a long journey, but in retrospect it had only been a few months. It was as if it was yesterday, and he remembered that he was still a penniless guy. But in these few short months, he had companions, power that he could rely on, subordinates, and even his own territory. Everything was just like everything he believed in. Step by step, he controlled the foreseeable future, until he changed the unknown fate between this ancient kingdom and himself. But now the ship had begun to turn around. It seemed like it was no longer sailing into the darkness, but there was a glimmer of light. How nice would it be if Senior knew all of this? Brando laughed in his heart. But a unique scenery that flashed past interrupted his thoughts. Brando noticed that it was a corner of a sentry tower that peeked out from the dense canopy of trees. He saw soldiers with pointed helmets on duty. Looking further away, there were sentry towers like this on every hill. Compared to the relaxed attitude of the cavalry outside, the defensive arrangements here can be said to be tight, Brando thought. At the same time, he compared the locations of the sentry towers with the map, and he knew that the adventurers did not lie to him. The map cost him 3,000 tor, but it seemed like it was worth the price. Brando looked into the distance without saying a word, and he tried to reconstruct the surrounding terrain in his mind. But just as he was concentrating, he suddenly felt someone bumping into him from behind. He turned around and saw a young man passing by him. The young man probably did not expect to bump into someone. Or rather, he thought that Brando was just a young man who was not much older than him, but he felt like he bumped into a mountain. The huge recoil almost made him fall to the side. The young man took a few steps forward before he could steady himself. He held his chest and gasped for breath. He was obviously shocked, but he quickly raised his head and looked at Brando with surprise. But his surprise quickly turned into an apologetic look. "I'm sorry." The young man suddenly realized his mistake and apologized with embarrassment. Brando looked at the boy. He was wearing a set of adventurer's clothing. It was made from leather and did not have any other advantages. The only good thing about it was that it was durable, but it was barely acceptable to look at. "Since you said you're sorry, give me back my things." Brando paused for a moment and replied. He had seen a lot of these pickpockets in the Amber Sword. Even if he did not have this ability in the game, he could still catch the young man. Now he was a real gold-tier swordsman. Now that he had the body of a gold-tier swordsman, it was much easier to use it than in the game with the help of the system. As soon as Brando said that, the apologetic look on the young man's face turned into one of surprise, but he immediately laughed. "You found out? That's amazing." The young man smiled, revealing his white teeth. Even though he was exposed, he did not quibble. Instead, he generously took out a pouch from under his clothes. It was Brando's money pouch. "It's okay." Brando took the pouch and replied, "Next time remember to be gentle." Also, he solemnly added, pick a target. The young man nodded, but he was a little curious. You're an adventurer? I don't think so. You're not from here, right? But I see that you seem to know the rules here very well. He shook his head again. But I agree with what you said about picking a fat target. But this time we didn't expect you to be so strong at such a young age. I feel that your reaction is much faster than Mars. That guy always likes to brag. By the way, brother, where are you from? Brando did not know who Mar was, nor was he interested in knowing. He was not used to the young man's familiarity. He thought for a moment and replied, I've been to many places. In fact, the rules of the Thieves' Guild are the same everywhere. But since you've returned the money, I don't want to make a big deal out of it. No one wants to offend a bunch of people for no reason. What he said was all based on his experience. In today's vaunt, an experienced adventurer would probably be able to say the same thing, but coming from a young man's mouth, it seemed a little demonic. Besides, people like you are very difficult to deal with. Brando concluded. The young man did not mind. In fact, he was happy as if Brando was praising him. After hearing Brando's words, he showed a curious expression. You said you've been to many places. That's impossible. You're so young. Brando shook his head and smiled, but it was because of this that the young man showed interest. He followed Brando and said, I'm Joka. What about you? Brando did not reply to his question, but the young man did not seem to mind. He put his hands behind his head and asked with interest, Are you telling the truth? You said we're like a thieves' guild? What's a thieves' guild like? Brando glanced at him and replied, What they did is similar to what you did. The young man raised an eyebrow. I heard there's going to be a war soon. Is that true? Brando felt a little depressed. Do you really think I'm a jack of all trades? He thought for a moment and replied, You're from here? Why are you so interested in the outside world? He could tell from the young man's accent that he was a local. But this time the young man smiled mysteriously and replied, Nothing. I just wanted to ask. Then I won't disturb you anymore. Let's talk when we have time. With these words he fell a step behind, then turned around and disappeared into the crowd. But Brendel's eyes were sharp, and he saw the boy running into the crowd and gathering with another group of people who were about the same age as him. He thought for a moment and decided to listen to what they were talking about. I failed. That guy is very strong. The young man who spoke first said, How strong can a guy that young be? I can even steal a few coins from the adventurers in town. Don't tell me you're too incompetent, Joka. Another voice chuckled and mocked. You can try, Mar. The young man retorted. If you don't ask for support, it looks like no one will support you. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 283. Why don't you try, Mar? The youth retorted. Tisk, he's already on his guard. You've got it all planned out. But he's pretty good. He's been to a lot of places. Joka said. Even though he's not a local, he seems to know our rules. I'm surprised. Humph. A weak voice spoke up. Mar got the story from a drunkard. He's just copying the rules. It'd be weird if he didn't know. Mar's face reddened. Cut the crap. Isn't that guy very knowledgeable? Why don't you sell those weird things to him? Maybe he'll like them. Even though he said sell, his tone sounded like he was mocking Mar. I can't be bothered to deal with a vulgar person like you. You don't know what's good for you. That's enough. I told you not to cause trouble. A fourth voice spoke up. It was a girl's voice. Brando froze. A woman really came in disguise? He couldn't help but curse at the riders outside before he continued to listen. We met that man at the trout in the forest yesterday. He was with a few women, and he didn't look like an adventurer. The girl's voice continued. I saw him ordering the most expensive wine at Old John's. He didn't look like he was short of money. He must be up to no good here. Brando frowned and cursed his bad luck. He decided to disguise himself and sneak into the mines after he heard the news, but he forgot that he had already exposed himself. However, with such a small mistake, he thought that it was impossible for someone to be caught so coincidentally. But he didn't expect Mother Marcia to play such a big joke on him. The scene yesterday afternoon was actually noticed by someone. While he was thinking about how to deal with this, the girl continued, "Should we report this?" Brando's heart skipped a beat. But the weak voice spoke up. "Sure, don't say anything. This has nothing to do with us. Just pretend that you don't know about this. This isn't a simple matter. He might have an accomplice. None of us want to lose our heads, right?" After this voice, the others were silent for a while. "All right," Mar replied. "It's decided then. After this, we'll be leaving this place. Let's not cause any more trouble." Everyone nodded in agreement. Brando turned around. He didn't think that someone in the group would say something so insightful. He couldn't help but be interested in the person who spoke. But when he turned around, the youths were long gone. Interesting. Brendel had a strange thought in his mind. Brando didn't walk for long on the 2-mile road to the mine. But when he entered the mine, he could feel that the surveillance around him had become stricter. Schaffel's silver mine was located in the middle of a mountain range. Because of the shallow mining, the surrounding mountain walls had been hollowed out, forming a concave valley. If one looked from the mouth of the valley, they would see large patches of gray and lead-black rocks. Brando didn't recognize the silver ore, but he could recognize the watchtowers that were built on top of the mountains. He couldn't help but frown when he looked at them. It was very troublesome to get in and out of this place. He wanted to lure the gold-rank swordsman out to kill him, but it didn't seem feasible now. He had to change his plan at the last minute. He looked around. The ground in the concave valley was relatively flat, but he couldn't see the entrance to the mine from here. Instead, he could see that there was a semi-fortress outside the valley. That should be the barracks of the local garrison. Count Ranner's secretary and adjutant should be there as well. Brendel turned around and looked at the piles of slag in the valley. There were mining carts everywhere, and workers were coming and going. Most of them were orderly, and only a few adventurers like him who came here for the first time were at a loss. But he wasn't nervous. He calmed down and followed behind the others. The soldiers wouldn't leave them alone, and he thought that someone would come and line them up soon. And it turned out that he was right. Brando soon saw a group of patrolling cavalrymen appearing from the side of the valley. They rode their mounts closer to the group of adventurers, but the cavalrymen who were wearing bright noble uniforms didn't seem to have the mood to waste time on them. Instead, they shouted at the group of adventurers, "Line up over there and get your number and tools." With that, the cavalrymen immediately turned around and walked towards the group of adventurers. Brando looked at the direction the cavalrymen pointed at. There, the manager of the mine was handing out tools and a wooden plate with a number written on it to the workers. Both of these items were not allowed to be lost or damaged in the mining area. If any of these were to happen, they would be severely punished. The wound of this era did not have any humanitarianism. Here, as long as there was a legitimate or not legitimate reason, it was not a big deal to be beaten to death. Even the secretary of the mine had the right to order a person to be hanged as long as he suspected that someone had stolen the count's ores. But Brando didn't care about that. He was only concerned about which camp he would be assigned to. The workers naturally lived in the valley for the next 6 days. Thus, no matter how stingy the mine officials were, they had no choice but to build a crude camp for the workers. Naturally, the main building of the camp was a thatched hut. It was filled with all sorts of unbearable smells for a modern person. If not for the fact that Brando's body was much stronger than that of an ordinary person after entering the Golden Realm, he was worried that he would faint from the stench when he entered the dimly lit hut. His worry quickly became a reality. He frowned as he stood in front of the crumbling hut. He compared the number in his hand with the location of the hut, but in the end he was disappointed. It was here. Brando's nose twitched. He was still a few feet away from the hut, but he could already smell the nauseating stench. At that moment, he suddenly felt that Yuta, Scarlet, and Medisha were wise not to come. And of course he had made the most foolish choice. He hesitated for a moment and could not help but look back. There were a total of 4 such camps in the valley. He had secretly noticed that most of the mercenaries were scattered, but he believed that this would not be a problem for the experienced warriors. Another piece of good news was that there were 3 people who were assigned to the same camp as him. He had already found some markings outside the huts. But no matter if it was good news or bad news, it could not solve the current problem. Brando frowned in distress. In the end, he hesitated and walked towards the dark hut. His expression was as if he was walking towards the execution ground. Of course, before entering the hut, he waved his hand and an invisible wind rolled up a few pebbles and formed a triangle at the door. After he had mastered the White Raven swordsmanship, he could now use it freely. Brando thought that this would be a very useful swordsmanship. If he had the time, he could go to Erwin's palace and learn the advanced parts of it. But this idea was a little unrealistic. After all, Erwin's secret swordsmanship was not something that could be easily leaked out. Princess Grafine must be proficient in this swordsmanship as well. But what conditions would she be willing to teach it to him was a problem. With this thought in mind, he entered the hut. Even though he tried his best to control himself, he could not help but cover his nose with his hand. The hut was quiet for a moment. Then he heard a voice that was almost inaudible. "Tisk, spoiled nobleman." This sentence was almost silent. If it was heard by a normal person, it would have been inaudible. But Brando heard it clearly. He raised his head and saw the people in the hut. Then he was stunned. This was too much of a coincidence. The people in the hut were none other than the youths he met before. He first saw the youth named Joka. He was smiling awkwardly as he sat on a straw mat opposite him. Then there was the youth named Mar beside him. He seemed to be the oldest among them and also the most muscular one. He was taller than Joka by a head, and was almost the same height as Brando. Brando immediately knew that this youth was the one who spoke earlier. He saw the youth's hand under his clothes and guessed that there was a dagger or short sword under his clothes. Brando could not help but curse at the patrolling knights outside. "You have some guts, but you don't know what's good for you." That was his first impression of the youth. Then he looked to the other side. Sitting on the straw mat was a youth who seemed to be stunted. Because of his thin limbs, his head seemed to be bigger than a normal person's. But the youth's gaze surprised Brando. It was neither Joka's nor Mar's alertness. It was a look of observation. He was observing him. Brando's interest was piqued. He knew that he was different from a few months ago. He had experienced battles, killed people, and became the leader of thousands of people. He even had the strength of a gold-ranked warrior. Even though he was trying to hide his identity, Brando knew that some things could not be hidden. For example, his gaze and temperament. In fact, there were very few people who could look him in the eye, but this youth was able to calmly observe him. Brando also observed the youth carefully. He noticed that there was a gray backpack beside the youth's straw mat, but he did not know what was inside. Finally, he looked up and saw the girl who was dressed as a boy. She was also a little skinny and did not look very pretty. She was just a little delicate with a few freckles on her face. Even though the room was dark, it was as bright as day in his eyes, and he could see everything clearly. Other than these few people, there were actually 3 other youths in the room. They seemed to be in the same group. But that was not what Brando wanted to complain about. What he really wanted to complain about was 8 people in such a small room. Oh my God, Martha. Even the third-rate university I went to wasn't this stingy. What a bunch of bastards. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 284. After Brando arrived, the room became silent. However, Brando did not care. He walked into the shed and sat down on the only empty straw mat. Everyone's eyes followed his movements and focused on him, especially the boy named Mar. He was almost frowning as he stared at him without moving an inch. Brando could not help but shake his head. Was he that scary? He did not do anything on the surface, but as a gold ranker, he knew everyone's movements like the back of his hand. Their tense muscles and heavy heartbeats proved that they were very nervous. However, he did not try to dispel their nervousness. He thought that it was better this way. Although these guys would not reveal his secret for the time being, who would know? It would be good if he could monitor their every move. Because of his presence, the strange intense atmosphere in the room lasted until the evening. To be exact, it was after dinner. Most of the workers arrived at the mine on Sunday night. The silver mine usually started work the next morning. Brando had a lot of time to familiarize himself with the situation here. However, he did not try the terrible dinner. He could not tell what was cooking in the pot. It was green and sticky like a witch's potion. It even had a rancid smell. Just one look was enough to make him lose his appetite, let alone eat it. He was only glad that he had brought enough food with him under Jana's reminder. At the same time, he suspected that the female mercenary leader had done similar work before. Otherwise, how could she be so experienced? After walking around outside and confirming the location of the other camps, Brando returned to his shed. But this time, as soon as he entered the house, he saw the malnourished boy sitting in the room. He did not seem to have gone out with the others. Brando looked to the side and found that the girl was accompanying the young man. He was stunned. "You don't eat." Brando thought that the young man was being ostracized by the others. After all, this kind of thing often happened in such groups. It was not rare. However, the young man shook his head. "I don't eat dinner." The young man did not seem to be afraid of him. He answered calmly, "Not eating dinner?" Brando was stunned. "Fasting." He immediately thought that this was a follower of the Silver Lily sect. In his impression, only those poor ascetics would have such a strange habit. The monks of the Silver Lily did not have dinner because they wanted to remember the days when Herod, the Flame King, was on the Great Plains. It was the most difficult period of the human race in the Dark Ages. They wandered the wilderness to escape the pursuit of the Myrnas. Countless people died of starvation on this road. The boy nodded at Brando's question. The Silver Lily sect was a small sect under the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It was very common in the Iraq region, but most of the followers of this sect did not practice fasting, unless they were apprentices who had been taught. So Brando looked at the young man and asked, "Have you studied under a cultivator before?" The youth nodded again. "I studied with a cultivator for a period of time. Although I didn't enter the sect, I still received his teachings." "Monsieur," he answered politely. "You can read?" Brando asked. The young man nodded. This was incredible. Freya only knew a few words when she was the captain of Butchie's militia. This was because she was lucky enough to meet Martin, who was the captain of Butchie's garrison. Martin was very famous in the game. In fact, he was different from the ordinary Erewhon soldiers because he was not only literate, but also very knowledgeable. From this point of view, Brando's grandfather was also the same. However, Brando knew that his ancestors were at least rich. His father was a miller, so it was normal for the family to have passed down education. The Roman was only literate because of his aunt. It was a joke that the descendants of witches could not read. As for the rest of the people, most of them were illiterate. In this world, there were not many people who could read. Brando sat down and asked with interest, "If that's the case, why are you still here? Although the Church of the Silver Lily is poor, it is still an official sect recognized by the Holy Cathedral of Fire." "Monsieur, I don't know which sect I belong to. The cultivator who taught me has already passed away," the young man replied. Brando suddenly understood. So that was the case. The young man probably did not receive any formal teachings, so he could only be considered as an ordinary believer. His interest in this small episode only lasted for a moment. His mind quickly returned to the operation. After the previous investigation, Brando had a preliminary understanding of the general situation in the mine. However, this made him feel more and more troubled. As far as he knew, the swordsman, who was their biggest threat in this operation, rarely appeared in the mine. Most of the time, he would stay in the barracks. Of course, it was impossible for them to sneak into the barracks and kill him. It was easy to sneak in, but to kill him and not be discovered was a bit of a fantasy. Brando could not think of a comprehensive plan at the moment. Fortunately, he had made up his mind to stay here for a week. He could only wait and see if he could find an opportunity during this week. However, as he was thinking about this, he heard the young man coughing. He turned around and saw that the young man was coughing badly with the help of the young woman. The young man probably noticed his gaze and looked up apologetically. He smiled and replied, "It's an old illness, monsieur. If you feel uncomfortable, you can sit further away." Brando did not mind. His constitution was now close to 100. Although he was not immune to all diseases, at least traditional diseases could not affect him. He shook his head and took out a water bag from his backpack. There is clean water in here. He knew that the water in the mine was not for humans to drink. Some of the water in the wooden bucket had already become smelly. Thank you. The young woman with faint freckles took the water bag from the young man's hand. Then she looked at Brando strangely. Brando was puzzled by her look. He did not think too much when he passed the water bag to her. It was just a bag of water. As a modern person who once lived in an era of abundance, Brando obviously did not care about this little thing. But he didn't realize that in a world like Vaunt, most people living at the bottom of society still believed in the law of the jungle where the strong preyed on the weak. Here, not everyone was willing to lend a helping hand to the weak for free. In any case, Brando's unintentional action had won him a good impression of the young man. After drinking a mouthful of water, the young man's coughing became more relaxed. However, he did not have the strength to speak. After a moment of silence, the young woman spoke first. Monsieur, I heard that you are very powerful? Brando was taken aback for a moment, thinking that this question was rather strange, and he had never considered this question before. Was he considered to be powerful? He compared it to his experience in the past when he was level 130 and shook his head. Just barely. Just barely is very powerful. I heard that the adventurers outside have a rank called Iron or something. I presume that Monsieur is one of them? The young woman asked. It's the Iron rank, the young man added. Brando looked at the two of them. He did not understand why they were interested in this. However, the division of professions was not a secret. In fact, many civilians knew about it. Barely enough, just a little bit more. Brando thought that it was already very eye-catching for someone as young as him to have the strength of an Iron rank. Most of the mercenaries under him were at least in their 30s or 40s when they entered the Iron rank. However, it was better for him to be as inconspicuous as possible. So he answered casually. He saw the two of them look at each other. Then the young woman asked again. Monsieur, are all adventurers like you? I'm talking about Black Iron rank? Brando looked at them. Of course not. As you know, those who have the strength of an Iron rank are considered very strong among adventurers. He was not lying. Who would become an adventurer if they were stronger? Unless they were the kind of people who liked to wander around, but those people were not the majority. But after answering, he added, Why are you asking this? We want to go outside and take a look. This time the young man spoke. Go on an adventure? The young man nodded. Brando thought that being an adventurer was not a good choice, but he did not dissuade him. In fact, to a certain extent, being a miner here was not much better. He was also a young man, so he naturally understood the young man's thoughts. But when he looked at the young man, he suddenly remembered that the young man knew more about the mine than he did. And the young man in front of him seemed to have let down some of his guard against him. Wasn't this a good opportunity to ask for information? So he thought for a moment and asked, I heard that some of the tunnels in Shaflan's silver mine are connected to the underground world of Jorgendy Ridge. Is that right? Sir, I don't know what you mean by Jorgendy Ridge. The young man shook his head. But there are some tunnels that lead to the underground world. Legend has it that no one has ever reached the end of the tunnel. Some people have even gone missing because of it. Brando thought that Tajiv's information was indeed correct. He suddenly had a vague idea in his mind. That sounds interesting. Are there any legends related to it? The young man exchanged glances with the girl beside him, but this small movement did not escape Brando's eyes. In fact, they already knew that Brando came here with ulterior motives, and now it seemed that he came for the strange legends in the mines. This was indeed fitting of an adventurer. Of course. The young man nodded slowly. Do you want to hear it, sir? Of course, Brando replied. If you tell me the details, I can give you a reward. He probably sensed that the other party had misunderstood, and was happy to keep the misunderstanding going. P.S. I forgot the time when I was drawing today, so I uploaded a hand-drawn drawing of Freya to the public. If you like it, you can go and take a look. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 285. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Early morning on Mount Greyhar was lit by a faint line of light purple and blue in the sky. As the stars gradually faded into the white, The forest on the top of the mountain formed a unique silhouette under the faint light. But it was even earlier in the mining area. The sky was still dark, but the sound of wooden whistles could be heard. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast a deep shadow on the ground. Brando was called out of the camp like the others. Before dawn, the air in the forest was a little chilly. He looked at the thing in his hand, not knowing what to do. It was a pickaxe. Its rough wooden handle was nearly 4 feet long. Probably because it had been used by many owners, its surface had been polished smooth. There was not a single protruding burr, and the dark gray tip of the pickaxe was a little blunt. But that was not the point. What made him sigh was that he never thought that he would be a miner again. Most people who had experienced the prehistoric era of online games would often have a sense of familiarity with mining in the muddled memories of that era. Brando was no exception. He had also been a miner in the game for a long time. He had worked day and night in the dark mines, mining, selecting ores, and then selling the high-quality ores on the market. It was boring to think about now, but at that time it was a source of endless fun and motivation. Because he watched the money he earned to equip his character step by step and become stronger, he was filled with a sense of spiritual satisfaction. Although this was just an achievement in the virtual world. Brando weighed the pickaxe and could not help but laugh at himself for a moment. But he looked up and carefully identified the figures in the crowd in the distance. He quickly found the presence of Yuta, Scarlet, and Medisha among a few familiar figures. They had obviously seen the marks he left in the forest at night and had now disguised themselves as miners and blended in with the workers. They wore headscarves, which was not uncommon among the mountain villagers, but their dirty clothes were bought by Brando from the teenagers. They had a lot of connections in the area, so it was very convenient for him. However, the biggest reward he got was the information he got from Cohen. It was the rumor that the Schaflund mine was connected to the underground world. When he heard Cohen's words, he had a vague idea in his mind, and after some time he finally connected this idea to his plan. As for whether his plan would succeed or not, it would depend on the situation today. Even Brando did not expect the opportunity to come so quickly. While he was thinking about it, he felt someone elbow him from behind. He turned around and saw Joka. It turned out that Joka saw him in a daze and came over to remind him, "Be careful. Once you get the tools, you'll be whipped if you're late," Joka whispered as he walked past him. The first thing he did was to check if his money pouch was still on him. When he turned around, he saw the frail youth nodding at him from afar. It was obvious that the youth had sent Joka over to remind him. After spending a short time with him yesterday, the teenagers were not as wary of him as before, but Cohen was willing to help him out of gratitude. Brando felt that Cohen did not want to owe him a favor or have anything to do with him. This was within his expectations, but he did not expect Cohen to have such a high status in the group. He thought for a moment and quickly caught up with Joka. "Where should I go?" Joka already knew that Brando was only here as a pretense, so he was not surprised by his question. "Since you don't know, just follow us. I know where there are more mines." "Thank you. This isn't a free service." Joka turned around and rubbed his fingers together. "You have money, right?" "Of course." Brando smiled. After the two of them entered the mine, the light naturally became soft and dim. After the silver mines in Schaflund were cleared out, the humans drilled several deep wells into the ground to mine the lower layers of the silver mines. The mine was crisscrossed under the Graha rock formation, but only oil lamps at great distances from each other outlined the meandering with the division of light and shadow. But Brando and Joka were not the only ones who went deep into the mine. The workers entered from several main entrances and quickly dispersed. He looked around, and when he saw Jana, Medisa, and Scarlet quietly blending into the crowd, he felt a little more at ease. He then retracted his gaze and followed Joka without saying a word. The place Joka mentioned was far away from the surface, but it was not the deepest part of the mine. According to Cohen, the deepest part of the mine was connected to Jorgendi Ridge. But Brando thought that it might be connected to the top layer of Jorgendi Ridge, which was the so-called Big Hive. The paths there extended in all directions, and it was difficult to find the way out if one got lost. It was also one of the biggest barriers between Jorgendi Ridge and the surface world. Not to mention that the Big Hive was also a place of danger. It was the habitat of many monsters, and it was not a peaceful place. But most of the mining areas were concentrated in the middle and upper levels. The two of them used a simple elevator to go deeper into the mine, and it took them about 10 minutes to reach the area where they were working. But as soon as they entered the underground, what happened next shocked Joka. The youth originally thought that Brendel would not be used to the low and oppressive environment in the mine, but in fact he was prepared to slow down his pace so that Brendel could keep up. The underground tunnel was not as spacious as the upper levels, and if he was not careful, he would hit his head and bleed. But the reality was completely different from what he had imagined. Brendel was like a fish in water when he came here. The young man walked forward as if he was walking on flat ground, and he was even more skilled than Joka himself. There were even some techniques that Joka had never seen before. The young man was stunned. How was this a novice? In his opinion, an old miner who had worked in this industry for decades was nothing more than this. In the end, Joka didn't even know how he managed to keep up with them. The ground was extremely hot, and by the time he stopped, he was sweating profusely and gasping for breath. Joka never thought that there would be a day when he would be out of breath while chasing someone down there. It had been a long time since he became an apprentice. Then Brando lit up a light source. The air was quite thin down here, and it was impossible to use a flame. He took out a fluorescent crystal for lighting. To save costs, the mine used the worst type of crystal, and it was only worth a few copper coins in the market. The crystal's light was so dim that it could be described as terrible, even weaker than a weak candle flame, but the light gray halo still carved out the uneven shadows of the surrounding stone walls. But I have to admit that Joka and the others chose a good place. There's a layer of light purple on the rocks, but it's not the original color of the silver ore. Maybe there's some kind of magic in the rocks. This was not uncommon, as there were often all kinds of magic-associated ores in Vaunt's veins. With Brando's rich experience, there should be a rich vein of or behind the rocks. The quality of the ore should be good, and there might even be some valuable ores. As an old miner with more than 10 years of experience, Brando did not doubt his judgment. At this time he heard a series of footsteps coming from behind. He turned around and saw Cohen and Mar. Cohen and Mar were shocked when they saw them. "Joka, you're so fast?" Joka panted as he glanced at Brendel and nodded to his companions. "You chose a good place," Brando said as he looked at the youths and the walls. "Humph," Mar snorted. "You can see it? The light purple rocks mean that there is cold iron in the ore. It's a rare ore." Brando looked at the slanted patterns on the rocks and asked casually, "Have you found quartz here before?" "Quartz?" Mar was surprised. "What the hell is that?" "It's also called light blue crystal," Brando replied. "Isn't that a fake crystal? Why would there be something like that in a silver mine?" Mar shook his head in disdain. "If you're looking for that, then you've come to the wrong place." Brando shook his head. Diagonal quartz was not a type of quartz. It was a type of minuscule mana ore that could produce moonlight effect. Therefore, it could also be considered as a type of moonstone. This type of ore was widely found in various large mineral veins. Although the inferior diagonal quartz was worthless, the best type of diagonal quartz was called magic eye gem. It was usually used as the most important part of the magic ring to store mana. Quartz in silver mines was usually of low quality, but it was an ore associated with cold iron. Brando looked at the glowing walls and said, "Then you're digging in the wrong direction. If you keep digging in this direction, you might find some cold iron ore." Mar and the other youths looked at each other. "How did you know? Why are you telling us?" If it was before yesterday, they wouldn't have believed Brando. But things were different now. Brando didn't seem to have any reason to lie to them. Brendel was not lying to them. He was just speaking from his experience as an experienced miner. "Then how do we dig?" This time it was the girl behind Cohen who asked. Author's note: what a tragedy. I accidentally wrote the Flame King's name as something else. Just ignore it. Haha. I'll be more careful next time. Also, please support me. I seem to have contracted a disease where I will die if no one supports me. Looking at the tickets, subscriptions, and favorites that aren't increasing, I feel a little weak. Chapter 286. Frost iron ore was an extremely valuable mineral. According to the game, once a metal weapon was mixed with frost iron, it would increase the damage to monsters by the same ratio. A pure frost iron longsword was twice as powerful as a normal longsword to a monster. As any country in the world of Vaunt, they had to face the troubles of monsters for a long time, so the demand for frost iron was extremely high. However, this kind of ore only existed in silver mines, copper mines, and some crystal mines, so it was often priceless. In the market, frost iron was almost as valuable as gold, but the proportion of frost iron was much higher than gold, so it could be said that it was as valuable as gold. When Brando said that there was frost iron here, it naturally attracted the attention of the youths. If they could dig out some frost iron and find a way to secretly transport some of the ores to a suitable buyer, they would be able to earn an unimaginable amount of wealth. Of course, in reality, most people like them had some means to do some sneaky things. It wasn't that they didn't know about the mines, but they were too lazy to ask about them. After listening to the girl's question, Brando looked at them and thought that it was a good idea to use some small favors to buy their hearts. After all, he might need their help. He pointed at the slanted lines on the wall and said, "Dig along these lines, but I can't guarantee that we will be able to dig it out, but there will definitely be a rich mine behind." Cohen nodded, and under his signal, Mar picked up a pickaxe and dug in that direction. Then the others followed suit. Brando had no intention of digging. Instead, he turned around and looked at the other end of the tunnel. The dark tunnel stretched to the end of the light. Where does it lead to? He turned around and asked. "There's another layer below," Cohen replied. He didn't work because of his body, but it seemed that the others didn't mind. Brando even saw someone give a portion of the ores they dug out to the weak youth. But that layer has been abandoned. Brando, of course, knew why the lower layer was abandoned. Last night, the young man had said that it was because when they were mining, they had dug through the tunnel between the beehive and the beehive, causing the monsters to swarm out. After that, it was not easy to drive the monsters back, but since then, no one dared to go to the lower layer of the mine. After hearing Cohen's words, he looked over there and walked straight into the depths of the tunnel. "Wait," Cohen stopped him. "Sir, it's best if you wait a while." Brando stopped. "Why?" "The supervisor will come to check in a while. You'd better wait for him to leave before you go." The young man replied. "When is he coming?" 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour." Brando frowned. "Will he come again?" "Yes, the supervisor will come every few hours, but it's hard to say exactly when." "A few hours seems to be enough," Brando thought. He nodded. "Thank you." At the same time, he thought that this was the benefit of buying people's loyalty. He picked up the pickaxe and knocked on the wall twice. Under the power of his gold-ranked strength, the rocks fell down like a landslide. But what really surprised Joka and Mar was that the youth's movements were extremely skillful. The pickaxe went straight into the veins without any deviation. A layer of low-quality silver ore slid down to Brando's feet. He fiddled with it. At first he was a little interested, but after a while, he just sat there and listened to the clanking of the pickaxe. Mar and the others dug quickly. The light purple wall was soon peeled away, revealing a layer of gray rock behind. Brando gestured for them to stop. He then had Joka throw a small piece of the rock over to him. He picked it up and studied it for a while. "This is the diagonal quartz. Let's continue digging." "You mean we have it?" Cohen asked. Brando nodded. The youth's faces revealed faint expressions of excitement. They wanted to go to the outside world together, so naturally they would need a large sum of money. And right now it seemed like an opportunity to make a fortune. The speed of the pickaxes became faster, and the clanking sounds were incessant. Brendel watched as the youths threw away the unwanted rocks one by one, and some of them rolled to his feet. But when he looked at them, he found that the quality of the quartz was getting better and better. Brando paused. This wasn't normal. Quartz was a product of magic, and it was usually found in high-purity crystal ores. It was the opposite for metal ores. He looked up and saw that Mar, Joka, and the others had stopped digging. After the gray rock was completely broken down, a deep blue vein was revealed. It was frost steel. However, what made them stop was not the frost steel, but the glowing crystals within the frost steel. Magic eye gems. There were 17 of them, and each one was the size of a thumb. He had never heard of anyone being able to dig out 17 magic eye gems in one go. Even the lowest grade magic crystal, the purple-yellow crystal, which was used to make intelligence headwear, had not been dug out in one go, let alone the magic eye gems. He patted his cheeks as if he was dreaming. He immediately looked up and asked, "Do you know what this is?" Everyone shook their heads. Brando looked at the frost steel or vein that contained the magic eye gems. In fact, the vein itself was abnormally large. Brando looked at it and estimated that there were at least 1 or 2 tons of frost steel ore in it. This amount of frost steel was already quite terrifying. The cold iron was also a product of mana contamination, but Brando could not figure out how this vein was so unique that it could allow so much mana to gather here and form such a huge vein. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. After a short pause, he said, "These are magic eye gems. They're very useful to me." The youths fell silent. "Okay, we'll split it 50-50. Mar immediately said. In fact, it was quite unfair for them to split it 50-50. After all, Brando was only one person, and there were 7 of them. But these youths knew that Brando was strong, and they were worried that he would be tempted by the wealth. But Brando shook his head. "I'll take them all. You can sell me your half too." He patted his waist. "I can pay immediately." Magic eye gems were the most important material for making magic rings, but that wasn't all. At least, Brando knew that the White Lion armor needed them. Even the long-lost wind-weaving bow of the Golden Elves needed them. 17 thumb-sized magic eye gems were enough to make 100 sets of armor. Brando couldn't help but think that this was really a case of traveling far and wide looking for something, only to find it by chance. The youths were silent for a while before Cohen asked, "How much are you willing to pay? You don't know the market price of the magic eye gem, so you won't be able to sell it." "I won't hide it from you, I'm only prepared to pay half the price," Brendel said calmly. "But even if it's half the price, I think it's enough to satisfy you." "How much is that?" the girl beside Cohen asked. 10 square gold coins. Everyone in the mine gasped. Square gold coins were the most common currency in the South, and 10 square gold coins were worth 13,000 tor. It wasn't a small sum. "You're really willing to pay that much?" Joka stammered. "Of course, together with your payment." The youth smiled awkwardly. He knew that Brando was joking with him. He had brought Brando down here and asked for 15 tor at most. The weak-looking youth didn't say a word. He nodded and gestured for his companions to pry out the crystals and give them to Brando. Brando paid without hesitation. He saw the youths nodding and biting the bag of gold coins as if they didn't believe that it was gold. But it was true that 15,000 tor was an astronomical sum for these youths. They wouldn't be able to earn that much even if they worked here for 10 years. Even if they sold the silver ores secretly, it would still be the same. Brando carefully put away the magic eye gems. The youth named Cohen asked, "Mister, do you want this cold iron?" Brando looked at the long cold iron vein. Of course he wanted it, but not now. Sooner or later this mine would be his. He shook his head. The youth sighed in pity. Without Brando, it would be much more difficult for them to get the ores out. However, this accident was only a small interlude in the boring mining process. About half an hour later, the supervisor finally arrived. He seemed to know the youths. Not only did he greet them, he even mistook Brando for a new member. Cohen, Mar and Brando didn't deny it this time. After the supervisor left, Brando finally found a chance to go deeper into the ground. After bidding farewell to the youths, he followed the deep, dark underground tunnel to the lowest level of the mine. The crisscrossing tunnels had been abandoned many years ago. There wasn't a single trace of life in the cold underground. If a normal person were to walk in this place alone, they would definitely feel their hair stand on end. However, Brando was satisfied as he walked in the darkness. It was best if there was no one around. In the end, he stopped at a blocked passageway. After making sure that it was deep enough, he stretched out his hand and a sky-blue card of fate appeared in his palm. It was the Wind Spirit Spider. P.S. You will die if you don't have anyone to support you. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 287. Who the hell is that guy? After Brando left, the youths began to whisper among themselves. Mar was the first to speak. He had been against them coming into contact with the mysterious guy since last night, but ever since Brando found the location of the cold iron mine and used a large sum of money to make a deal with him, he had to admit that dealing with Brando had its benefits. However, Joka, who was the first to deal with Brando, was a little worried. 13,000 tor was not a small sum, and he felt that it was too easy to get the money. He couldn't help but turn back to look at Cohen. This frail young man was the most knowledgeable among them, and not only that, Cohen also knew magic. Every time they were injured in the mining area or in a fight, Cohen would use magic to heal them. Although there was no magic that could heal wounds in an instant, it was at least more effective than herbs. Just like that, Cohen had already become the leader of the group. It was just that Mar wasn't too convinced of it. However, Joka knew that Mar was only feeling embarrassed because he was pulled down from his position as the leader of the mercenaries. It's nothing, Cohen shook his head. Let's continue digging. This has nothing to do with us. Just as he finished speaking, he heard a scream coming from the mine. It came from the direction of one of their companions. Everyone's heart skipped a beat as they stopped and looked over. There were many mysterious legends about the depths of the dark mine. Although no one had ever been there, they were willing to meet any accidents in such a place. However, they saw their companion running out in a panic. Come and look over here. The young man hurriedly shouted. What's wrong? Cohen asked. Cohen, you'll know when you come over. I don't know what this is. Everyone was stunned again. Cohen exchanged glances with the others beside him, and then everyone leaned over together. However, they were stunned the moment they walked over. Behind the deep blue vein, which was obviously where the young man had mined, a silver edge was exposed behind the broken rock stratum. It was definitely not a rock, nor was it an ore. Instead, it looked like some kind of man-made object. The youth said anxiously, Look at this. He picked up the pickaxe and showed it to the others. They saw that the tip of the pickaxe had been neatly shaved off, and the cut was as smooth as a mirror. You made this. Cohen frowned. He did not know what it was either. The youth nodded. That's a sword. It's so sharp. Mar immediately said, I've heard that there are residents of the underworld below us. That must be their weapon. Mar, why would a weapon from the underworld come here? Someone else had a different opinion. It's possible. Didn't the monsters come up here before? Mar, you idiot. That's because the workers dug a tunnel. This time, even Joka couldn't take it anymore. But there wasn't any passage before we started digging. Not to mention that the sword was buried in the rock. At the very least, he agreed with Mar about the sword. Mar was about to retort, but Cohen interrupted them. Stop arguing. Let's dig it out and take a look. Dig it out? The girl was confused. It's useless to us. Cohen, I'm a little uneasy. Let's just leave it here. The youth hesitated, but his curiosity was piqued when he saw the silver gleam in the rock. He believed that Mar was right. It was something left behind by the residents of the underworld. However, he glanced at the pickaxe. Such a sharp weapon must be worth a fortune outside. Dig it out, he said. Everyone nodded. The youth's exuberant curiosity eventually overcame their fear of the unknown. However, when Cohen, Mar, and Joka began to dig out the strange weapon that was buried deep underground, there was a huge commotion in the mining area. A terrifying rumor spread among the miners that a monster had been discovered in the lower levels of the mine. The rumor was so real that the supervisors had no choice but to send a group of soldiers to investigate. However, they never returned. In less than half an hour, a written report was placed on Perkins's desk. For the first time, the energetic young man in his 30s, according to Vaughn's calculations of course, felt that things were getting a little tricky. Perkins was able to come to this mine to work for Count Randner partly because he was valued by the latter, but it was also because of his connections with various parties, especially Countess Randner. As a nephew of Countess Randner's family, he hitched a ride to this mine and waited for his term to end before joining the Count's team of advisors. Perkins knew that this mine was highly valued by Count Randner, and anyone who could successfully gain the latter's trust would eventually become one of the Count's most trusted retainers. This was why he was filled with enthusiasm for this mission, and it could even be said that he came to this place full of pride. Everything seemed to be in order until this morning. The report woke him up from his daydream. The report stated that a giant spider was seen in the lower levels of the mine. Normal spiders would not grow to the size of a human's head, so it must be a monster. Perkins immediately broke out in cold sweat. He knew what happened in the mine more than a decade ago, and if the workers were to dig through the tunnel to Georgandy Ridge again, he could not imagine how serious the situation would be. The young man immediately felt that he could not relax. He repeatedly confirmed the situation in the mine, but the news was worse than the one before. When a group of soldiers disappeared into the mine, Perkins knew that he was in trouble. He knew that he had no ability to do so. He originally planned to get a more leisurely position in the mine that would attract Count Ranner's attention, but he did not expect his luck to be so bad that he encountered the worst situation. Perkins was at a loss as to what to do. He slumped back into his seat, wondering if Count Ranner would chop him into pieces if he lost the mine. This was what Coden saw when he opened the door to the mine. Coden, who had entered the gold-ranked realm 30 years ago, and was one of Count Ranner's most trusted subordinates, saw the young man in a daze. Even though he knew that Coden did not have much ability, and that he was just a person who got in through the back door, he could not help but feel a sense of disdain in his heart. He knew that Coden did not have much ability, but he did not expect Coden to be completely useless. He coughed once, and only then did he snap Perkins out of his dazed state. Perkins's gray eyes lit up when he saw Coden standing by the door. Of course, he recognized this old executive adjutant, guard captain, and the highest military officer in the mine. Coden was different from him. He was already Count Ranner's right-hand man before the year of White Frost. Coden was here to manage the daily operations of the mine, and he was fully trusted by Count Ranner. Even though Perkins had cursed Coden more than once for being a damned old man, he still knew that he had to show a certain amount of respect on the surface. Furthermore, Coden was very likely to be his savior at this moment. He shouted like a drowning man grabbing onto the last straw. "Mr. Coden, you're here. We're in big trouble now." "What do you mean by big trouble?" Coden said with a hint of disdain. However, Perkins didn't dare to be too calculative at a time like this. He hurriedly recounted everything that had happened. Coden had already understood most of the situation before he came here. In fact, he was already cursing in his heart. That damned bastard kept the news from him from the start, and only called him over when things got out of hand. If he knew the truth earlier, at least his soldiers would not have lost their lives for no reason. Coden was very unhappy at this moment, but he knew that this matter was of great importance. He could only suppress his dissatisfaction and ask coldly, "Oh, then what do you plan to do, Mr. Coden?" Perkins was stunned. He knew that Coden was using this opportunity to make him unhappy, but he knew that he had not handled this matter properly. He could only smile and say, I'm not sure about the situation down there, but I'm worried that the miners will riot. I plan to send the guards down to maintain order." He looked at Coden's gloomy face and gulped. "That, at least we'll need some people." Coden snorted coldly and interrupted him. "Bullshit idea. If you send the guards down, won't the miners know that something is wrong down there? They'll only become more chaotic. There are thousands of miners in this mine, and you want to maintain order with less than 100 people? Aren't you thinking too much, Mr. Coden?" Perkins' face was almost disfigured by the scolding, but fortunately, he was thick-skinned and replied, "Then what should we do?" "I'll go down and take a look." Coden wiped the hilt of his sword. "Although the monsters down there are troublesome, they won't be able to stop me. I'll go down and see how serious the situation is." Good. Perkins said the word good 3 times. Although the matter was not resolved yet, he was relieved that Coden was going to take action. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 288. After releasing the wind spirit spiders, Brando immediately returned to the upper level. Hundreds of wind spirit spiders were crawling up the mine shaft. He knew that the panicked miners would soon spread the news to the surface. A similar incident had happened in Schaflund mine before, but the attackers were dino beasts from the beehive zone. The mine had suffered a huge loss of manpower and property. Now that a similar monster attack had occurred, the mine's manager, who had experienced it before, would definitely do something about it. Brando did not go back the way he came. Instead, he chose a different path. He advanced in the dark tunnel. His 20 perceptive sense allowed him to adapt to the dim light. The tunnel was so deep that he could not see his own fingers, but it was as bright as day in his eyes. He leisurely passed through a tunnel that the wind spirit spiders had once passed through. The workers here had long since fled in terror. The surroundings were empty, and there was not a single sound to be heard. Brando came to the elevator and activated the Magitech. The simple elevator slowly rose and brought him to the upper level. The next level was the tunnel that transported the ores to the surface. There was a wooden track on the floor, and the space was higher. The walls were supported by sturdy wooden frames. However, under the light of the torch there was no one around. Most of the workers had fled. Brando walked out of the elevator and quickly found an inconspicuous mark on the rock layer. He followed the mark and turned a corner. Suddenly, a black shadow lurked in the shadows and lunged at him like a venomous snake. Brando's cheek was stung by the sharp blade, but he reacted quickly. He raised his hand and blocked the hand that was holding the sword. Just as he was about to counterattack, he recognized the sword. His left hand immediately grabbed his opponent's wrist and forced him to drop the sword. He heard a clang as the sword fell to the ground, followed by a soft groan of pain. It was a woman's voice. "My lord." Yuta finally recognized Brando. The red-haired, blue-eyed female commander frowned and hugged her wrist. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it was you." She knew that Brando was powerful, but she did not expect him to be this powerful. Among the three leaders, only Cornelius knew Brando's true strength. The others did not have a clear understanding of his strength before. Brando merely grabbed her wrist and exerted some force, and she felt as though her entire body was tied up. Her wrist felt like it was broken, and she could not move at all. Yuta rubbed her wrist and was speechless. She was also a silver tier, but she was restrained the moment she made a move. Was there such a huge gap between gold and silver tier? "Where are Scarlet and Medisha?" Brando asked. "They are on the other side." "My lord, why did you call us here?" "It's a little troublesome to lure the enemy out. We need to change our plan." Brando flicked out his sword and sent the sword flying into the air. The sword hit the wall and bounced back, but he caught it and passed it back. "I have a plan. I received news that there was a serious accident in the Schaflund mine more than 10 years ago. The miners dug through the tunnels leading to Jorgendy Ridge, which led to the invasion of monsters. My lord, are you going to use this method to lure him out?" Medisha's voice came from behind Yuta. Brando saw the Silver Fairy Princess and Scarlet coming out from behind. They had heard the commotion. The girl recognized the wind spirit spiders that Brando had summoned, and she easily came to a conclusion. Brando nodded. "The captain of the guards is called Koden. He personally led the guards to drive the monsters out of the mine in the last accident. This time he will most likely remember his experience. It's not a bad place to fight." The red-haired girl flicked her long ponytail and looked up at the ceiling. "But aren't you afraid of causing a collapse? Let's just end it quickly. The enemy is an intermediate gold tier." "It is a little tricky." Brando furrowed his brows. His opponent was not a greenhorn, but a gold-rank swordsman with plenty of experience. "But I don't have a better idea at the moment." The three of them suddenly stopped talking. They heard footsteps coming from the other side of the mine. The footsteps were messy but not panicked. It must be the guards patrolling the mine. However, only Brando, who had the highest level among the four of them, heard the faint sound of footsteps. Although the level of an elementalist did not increase Brando's strength, it greatly improved his perception. Although Brando's absolute strength was only a lower gold tier, his perception was actually higher than Koden's. At the very least, he was above the intermediate gold tier. He immediately put his index finger to his lips and made a shushing gesture. He warned Medisha and Scarlet with his eyes that the big fish was approaching. Although Yuta did not know what was going on, she knew what was going on when she saw the serious expressions on their faces. Koden did not enter the mine alone. He said that he would go alone, but it was just an excuse. The mine was huge and complex, and the master swordsman would not be able to take care of it alone. He brought a small group of 10 people with him. However, the strange thing was that the spiders mentioned in the report seemed to have disappeared the moment he entered the mine. He and his men patrolled the first and second floor, but they did not find any of the monsters in the rumors. Koden could not help but feel suspicious. He almost thought that someone was deliberately spreading the rumor. But the group of soldiers that went missing reminded him that there was something wrong. When Koden reached the third level, he discovered that the tunnels were empty. The miners had long since escaped upwards. leaving the place in a silent and desolate world. For the first time, the master swordsman sensed that something was wrong. They followed the wooden tracks and searched. The Shaflun silver mine was so complicated that the soldiers had to check the map as they walked. But at that moment, Coden heard a sound. It seemed like someone was talking in front of him. He did not dare to confirm it, so he immediately ordered his men to spread out and move forward cautiously. But when he found out the source of the sound, he and his men were stunned. There was a woman there. To be exact, it was a little girl with silver hair and silver eyes. Not only that, but she also had pointy ears. The soldiers could only recognize that she was an elf, but Coden was a knight. Not only did he learn etiquette in a noble family, but he also read books about geography and history. The old man recognized her at a glance. She was the legendary silver elf. He rubbed his eyes and almost thought that he was presbyopic or that he had seen a ghost. The silver elves had disappeared hundreds of years ago, and any books that mentioned them would use the word legend in front of them. But now this legend was standing right in front of him. Coden was surprised, but he did not let his guard down. Suddenly, he heard a slight movement behind his ear. He immediately turned around and saw two people behind him. One of them was a young man wearing a gray-white leather armor, and there were 5 or 6 long swords hanging from his waist. Coden was stunned when he saw the young man. Why does he have so many swords? What kind of school does he belong to? But Coden immediately saw a young mercenary girl with a halberd following behind the young man. The old swordsman suddenly realized that he was no longer in the mood to care about the silver elves. Instead, he connected the dots and realized that these people were here for him. But he did not ask any nonsense like, "Who are you?" He raised his eyebrows and asked, "How much money did Jera give you?" Brando was stunned. "Then who are they?" Scarlet asked in confusion. "Humph," Coden drew his sword. "If they are not sent by my old enemy, then they must be the Count's enemies. But it's all the same, come and die." Under his command, the soldiers unsheathed their swords. Even though Coden's hair was white, he still looked majestic and awe-inspiring. It was as if he had lost his courage in the past. Count Randner had 13 knights that he trusted the most. Among them, Baldron and Sean were the strongest, but Coden was the only one who had participated in the 10 Years' War. He was also one of the top 5 knights in terms of strength. It was rumored that the old swordsman obtained gold-ranked strength 30 years ago, and he was now a middle-ranked knight. He pulled out his sword from its scabbard, but Yuta, who was hiding far away, had a different thought when she saw the scene. She glanced at Brando. Coden, the captain of Shaflun's guards, obtained gold-ranked strength 30 years ago, but he was already a middle-aged man in his 50s at that time. Now that he was old, he was only a middle-ranked gold-ranked knight. Compared to this young lord, a mortal is indeed different from a monster, she thought. When Coden saw Brando unsheathing his sword, he did not think much of it and wondered who sent 3 immature fools to cause trouble for him. But when he saw the young man releasing his aura, the air around him suddenly turned cold, and a layer of white frost began to spread from his feet, causing his eyelids to twitch. Elemental activation, gold-ranked strength. Such a young gold-ranked swordsman? But the old swordsman's shock did not end there. He immediately saw the electric arcs on Scarlet's halberd and arms, as well as the layer of white spiritual energy that condensed around Medish's body. He immediately felt his heart skip a beat. 3 opponents who had entered the gold stage. But who would be willing to send 3 geniuses here to cause trouble for him? He looked like he was in his 20s, but he was already a gold-ranked swordsman. This kind of person would attract attention no matter where he went, and would not be sent here to be an assassin. Coden subconsciously took a step back, but it was not to show weakness. Being surrounded by 2 gold-ranked opponents, even he had to consider how to protect himself. P.S. The condition of I will die without support has improved a little, but to fully recover, I still have to rely on the support of my fellow students. Chapter 289. The first to attack was Brando. Coden did not dare to be careless in the face of a famous master swordsman. He immediately unleashed the White Raven sword style. The sword shattered from top to bottom, but the wind pressure from the sword formed a crescent-shaped gust of wind that swept towards Coden and his soldiers. The air was either compressed into a thin blade, or pushed away by a huge force. However, The gust of wind that was pushed away was equally lethal. With a few loud bangs, the gust of wind had already broken the wooden pillars that supported the walls on both sides of the cliff. Scarlet could not help but glance at the tunnel, worried that it would collapse at any moment. However, even the sturdy wood could not withstand the impact of the cyclone, not to mention the guards who had not even reached the level of iron. The wind from the sword swept through the entire corridor, and the 10 guards immediately fell to the ground. If they were not beheaded, then they were cut in half at the waist. The White Raven sword style was an intermediate-level swordsmanship, and Coden did not dare to take the attack head-on. He leaped up to avoid the sharpest part of the sword, and used his hand to break through the cyclone at the top of the tunnel. At the same time, he thrust his sword towards Brando. These veterans who had experienced 10 years of war were most familiar with the classic Erewhon military swordsmanship, and Coden was no exception. However, Brando was very familiar with this style of swordsmanship. He quickly retreated when he saw Coden's attack, and Scarlet caught up with him. Clang! She raised her halberd and blocked the sword. Lower gold tier. Coden immediately judged Scarlet's strength. Get out of my way! The old man roared and pressed his sword downwards. Scarlet's eyes widened in shock, and she took 7 steps back before she could stop herself. Coden was also shocked. He thought that Scarlet would at least retreat to the side of the tunnel, but she stopped at such a short distance. Obviously, he did not expect Scarlet's physique to be far superior as an oracle. As soon as the old man landed on the ground, he immediately launched an attack on Brando, who was retreating. The captain's goal was very clear. He wanted to break through, but how could Brando let him do as he wished? Although the sword in his hand had shattered, he was already prepared and immediately pulled out another long sword. Coden finally understood why the young man had prepared so many swords, but it was a joke that a gold-rank swordsman didn't have a sword that suited him. The old man sneered and took a step forward. The long sword in his hand was like a silver chain as it slashed down towards Brando. That sword move could not be said to be exquisite. It was just the most basic sword move of a battle formation sword art. However, when this old swordsman used it, it felt as if the sky was falling and the earth was cracking, as if Mount Tai was pressing down on him. Holy *T. Brando felt that he had made a mistake in his judgment. Whether it was Conrad or Turst, none of the gold-ranked swordsmen he had seen before could compare to this old man. Even Buga, who was stronger than him, did not give him as much pressure as Coden. Brando knew the reason. The former was just a swordsman while the latter was a soldier. He had only seen this kind of aura and swordsmanship from one person in this world. The White Knight Ebden. It could be said that other than the Oracle of the Earth, Ebden was the one who forced Brando into a corner the most. Ebden was only a silver-ranked swordsman. Although Brando's own strength was weak, others might not be able to do the same. The soldier's swordsmanship was unrestrained, with an innate killing intent and aura. It was as if he was not wielding a sword but a wall. It gave people the illusion that there was no way to avoid it, and that a great disaster was about to befall them. Ebden's swordsmanship was one of the best, and Coden was a veteran who had fought in the war for 10 years. His swordsmanship was far superior to Ebden's, and even Brendel, who had been on the battlefield for a long time, felt a chill run down his spine. However, ashes were ashes after all. Brando gritted his teeth and dodged to the side, causing Coden's sword to miss. The sword hovered in the air, but the air current lashed down like a whip. With a loud bang, a 10-meter-long dent appeared in the ground. The entire tunnel seemed to tremble. Brando's scalp went numb. For the first time, he felt that it was not a wise choice to fight Coden here. No matter how he looked at it, the tunnel would not be able to withstand their attacks. However, Coden did not seem to mind. He was slightly surprised that Brando was able to dodge his attack. His gray eyebrows twitched slightly. However, he did not slow down and immediately swung his sword towards Brando. He wanted to force Brando away. This series of attacks happened in the blink of an eye. Scarlet had just stabilized herself. Brando saw Metisha rushing towards him, but she was still a step away. Coden's sword was right in front of him, but he could not retreat. However, Brando was furious. Do you think I'm a sick cat if I don't show my might? He activated charge, and with a burst of speed he disappeared from Coden's sight. When he reappeared, He had already dodged Koden's sword and stabbed towards his throat. What incredible speed! Koden could tell that this was the Sun Knight's skill. He blocked the attack with his own hand. When their swords clashed, both of them could tell that the other's understanding of swordsmanship was different. They were both Erwin's battle formation swordsmanship, but at this moment it was time to determine who was better. Koden was excited, but when he saw Brando take a step back and his sword slanted to the side, his eyes flashed. This isn't Erwin's battle formation swordsmanship. Koden immediately took a step back and blocked Medish's spear with his own sword. However, he did not take any further action. Instead, he shouted in a deep voice, "Stop!" When Brando and Koden began to fight, the entire tunnel shook a few times. Joka felt sand falling on his shoulder. He touched it with his hand and looked up at the top of the tunnel. He could not help but ask worriedly, "What's going on? Did the tunnel collapse?" He turned to his companions and asked, "Did you guys feel it?" Mar and the others were busy digging. They had almost dug out the object from the wall. Because it was too sharp, they had no choice but to start from the sides and slowly push this shiny silver object out of the gradually sunken rock wall. When the rock layer was peeled away, they could see the outline of the object. It was not a sword, but more like a silver sphere. But why is it so sharp? They could not figure it out. The sphere slowly protruded from the wall. Some of them even touched it carefully, but it was not a big deal. This made them feel relieved. But at this time the girl shivered. "I feel a little cold." She looked around anxiously as if something was hiding in the darkness. The temperature seems to have dropped. Cohen's attention was focused on the silver sphere. There was a faint golden color on its surface. He had read about this metal in a book left behind by a monk, Mithril. The young man's eyes couldn't help but burn. In his memory, compared to the value of Mithril, winter iron was no different from a rock. He shook his head after hearing what the girl and Joka said. "There are occasional tremors in the mine, but they're very small. There's nothing to be surprised about. Don't scare yourself." Then he turned around and said, "You know what, we're rich now." He smiled. "Now we don't have to go out and make a living. We can live the life we want." However, before he could finish his sentence, Mar suddenly exclaimed in surprise. Everyone turned to look at him. After Mar swung his pickaxe down, a large chunk of the rock wall suddenly fell off, revealing a layer of smooth black rock behind. Everyone couldn't help but be stunned. They thought that the blue cold iron or vein was at least 1 to half a meter deep, but they didn't expect there to be such a thing behind it. "This isn't natural," someone suddenly shouted. "Look, there are words on it." Everyone looked over and sure enough, they saw a row of densely packed words written on the black rock wall. However, it seemed that because of the passage of time, the words had already become blurred. No one could see what was written on it. Cohen slowly walked over and touched it. It was cold to the touch. He turned his hand over and saw a patch of black on it. "It's rust," he said. "This is iron." "What is it?" someone asked. The other youths looked at each other. Cohen did not know how to answer. He had some knowledge, but it was limited. This strange excavation made him feel a little nervous, but there was also a faint excitement. Even in the young man's confused state of mind, he could roughly guess that he had dug up something incredible. "Come, let's continue digging. We'll dig it out." Mar was a man of action. "Wait, you know what it is?" Joka said in annoyance. He had been worried since the beginning. "Plus it's so big. You won't be able to bring it out even if you dig it out." The last sentence moved Mar. He stopped and looked at Cohen with a questioning gaze. "Let's dig out the silver ball first." Cohen checked the iron wall and found nothing. He lost interest and decided to get the actual benefits first. But this time, as soon as he finished speaking, the entire tunnel shook. This time it was different from before. It was as if the entire tunnel was shaking violently. All the youths were shaken to the ground at the first moment. "Look, that thing is glowing," a voice suddenly shouted amidst the screams. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 290. Koden took a step back and used his sword to deflect the silver elf princess spear as he shouted, "Stop!" But right at this moment, just as everyone's movements became sluggish, The ground in the mine suddenly began to shake. Brando, Medisha, and Scarlett's expressions changed and they looked up instinctively. Crack! A 10-meter-long fissure appeared on the ceiling of the mine. Sand and gravel fell from the fissure and hit everyone's faces. This sudden turn of events interrupted the battle, and Brendel immediately lowered his head and squinted his eyes. He turned around and shouted for Scarlett behind him to quickly retreat. He knew something was wrong, but the mine was more fragile than he thought. Brendel naturally concluded that this was the result of several gold-ranked forces fighting below, but he had a vague feeling that something was wrong. Their battle with Coden had only just begun. Logically speaking, it shouldn't have caused such a huge commotion. But he didn't have time to think about it. As he retreated, Scarlett suddenly shouted from the other side, "My lord, be careful." But before she could finish her sentence, Schaflun's mine began to tremble for the second time. Huge rocks finally broke free from the mountain's shackles and crashed down. The light in the mine suddenly became chaotic and dim. Brando wanted to avoid it, but a large amount of sand and gravel rushed towards him. Damn it! That was his last thought before everything turned dark. The terrifying tremors from the underground even reached the surface. The young noble clerk who was restraining the workers in the mine lost his balance and fell down. With great difficulty, Perkins crawled up from the rubble with his head bleeding. He felt the ground beneath his feet trembling and rumbling. He could not help but turn pale and look around in panic. The entire mine was in chaos. Most of the miners had been thrown to the ground, but even more people were running away. What's going on? An earthquake? Is Lady Martha angry? Perkins couldn't help but shudder. Frada in the Moon of Frost had a hint of desolation. Griffine's pale silver eyes reflected a glimmer of light as she looked out from the balcony. In the distance, the white fog seemed to be dragging the canopy of a forest with thick, ink-like ink. Some of the trees had already lost most of their leaves. But the fireplace in the room was still burning. Sparks from the red charcoal occasionally drifted out of the iron fence and onto the red bricks outside the fireplace. The room became warmer. Her Royal Highness only had a red and white fur shawl draped over her nightgown. Her long silver hair was a little messy and floppy, as if she was sleepy. Under her nightgown she was barefooted. She lowered her head and absent-mindedly placed her small white feet on the fluffy carpet. She watched her white skin sink into the soft fluffy fur and then smiled. Of course, Oberbeck couldn't see what was going on under the table. Otherwise, he would have scolded the princess, who was half his student, and told her to pay attention to her appearance and behavior. However, the old vassal's gaze was more focused on the document on the table. It was actually 3 days after the knight's tournament. The document was personally delivered by Maynoldt. The female knight was standing beside Oberbeck, one step behind him. She was wearing a black knight's robe. The skin on her hands and neck was as white as porcelain. She stood straight and looked straight ahead. The room was silent for a moment. After a while, Princess Griffine recovered from her low blood pressure. She rubbed her forehead and lifted her silver eyes weakly, as if she was tired. Her 2 subjects were reflected in her pupils. "I'm sorry, Oberbeck, Maynoldt. I woke up a little late." "Rest well. Strike a balance between work and rest." It wasn't Oberbeck who said this, but the female knight. Oberbeck turned to look at her. The female knight was expressionless, but the vassal wasn't surprised. He had always been like this, out of concern for the princess. It wasn't just out of concern for the queen. "What is this?" Princess Griffine took a look at the report written on the parchment. She frowned and placed her hand on a crystal shard the size of a fist. The shard immediately lit up, and images appeared on it. Upon closer inspection, it was a record of the knight's tournament a few days ago. However, the image of a young girl was shown. The princess recognized that it was Freya. She paused for a moment and replayed it. Princess Griffine looked up and asked curiously, "Is there a problem?" "Swordsmanship," Maynoldt replied. "Swordsmanship? There's a problem with that little girl's swordsmanship." This time it was Oberbeck who answered. "Isn't that Everton's daughter? What problem could there be?" the young girl asked. Maynoldt nodded and took out a bell and shook it. The bell rang and the door opened. A young knight wearing a chest plate and a red cloak with white fur leaned forward and asked, "What orders do you have, Lady Maynoldt?" "Attack me." the female knight ordered concisely. The knight was slightly surprised, but he didn't ask any questions. He opened the door and took a step back, then immediately drew his sword. As a knight of the royal family, he had the strength of a gold tier, and his attacks were clean and efficient. However, Maynard simply took a step back and dodged his first attack. The young girl dodged to the side and at the same time closed the distance between her and the knight. She drew her sword halfway and pressed it against the knight's neck. Half of her body leaned forward and pressed the knight to the ground with her sword. In the blink of an eye, Maynard held her half-unsheathed sword to the knight's neck with one hand in front of the other, and the knight fell to the ground on his butt. "Maynard, your swordsmanship has improved again." The half-elf girl's eyes lit up. However, the knight who was sitting on the ground was not depressed at all. He held Maynard's hand and stood up. He lowered his head and replied, "I'm sorry to disappoint you." Maynard had always been the Griffin knight. Corvado. She was the knight captain of Oderfice's royal guards. Although they weren't completely in the same system, she could still command the knights of the royal guards. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was half the boss of these knights. Towards this female boss, although there were some dissenting voices, most of the young knights in the knight regiment were convinced and looked forward to her. In the words of a jealous person, this female knight was already notorious for her ferocity. Maynard nodded and did not say much. Instead, she kept her sword and replied to Princess Griffin. "This is a military swordsmanship. A swordsmanship that was born to end a battle quickly." The silver-haired girl thought for a moment and said, "I don't remember our country's military swordsmanship being like this." "Because it has been modified," Audiobook replied. "This is a modified military swordsmanship. It focuses on the technique, not the technique. The core of this swordsmanship is to use the simplest method to cause the enemy to lose their ability to fight." The minister pointed to his neck, waist, arms, and thighs. "Usually it's to kill, but there are other methods. However, those who have not accumulated experience in battle would not be able to use this swordsmanship." Griffin fell into deep thought. She placed her hand on the crystal again and replayed the image. She noticed the second half of Freya's last strike. "You're talking about this?" The female knight nodded. "After Miss Maynard told me about this, I observed it carefully," Audiobook replied. "This little girl's move to snatch the sword was purely improvised, but the attack after that has the shadow of a military swordsmanship." The half-fairy princess frowned, but immediately relaxed and revealed a look of interest. "You said that this swordsmanship requires a long period of experience in battle, but she did not have such experience. She used to be a militia in Wuxia and participated in the war with Madara, but it was only for a few days." "Yes, but there is another possibility." Audiobook lowered his head and replied, "She is a veteran." "You mean someone taught her?" "That Martin?" Griffin asked. "No, I sent someone to investigate this old guard captain. He is very capable and experienced the November War, but he is just an ordinary veteran." "Yes, his other disciple did not know this swordsmanship either." Griffin nodded. She was referring to Breton. But there was another possibility, and that was that Freya was a genius, and did not need a long period of time to comprehend her own understanding of swordsmanship. But Freya's ability was obvious to everyone present, so this possibility was not mentioned. Who could it be? Griffin was puzzled. "She does not know anyone else." "There is another person who is out of our sight, Your Highness." Griffin immediately reacted, and a strange light flashed in her silver eyes. "You mean him?" Audiobook nodded. The half-fairy princess quickly calmed down. "But he is just a young man unless someone taught him." She tilted her head. "Then do you know more about him?" Griffin suddenly realized that when she asked this question, there was a strange expectation in her heart. Was it to find out more about this matter? Or was it to find out more about him? Perhaps it was a combination of both, but the princess herself did not know. "Unless he can return to Wuxia." "You did not get any information from the people who escaped from Wuxia. They are not familiar with him." Maynard interrupted. "I even sent someone to ask Breton privately, but he said he did not know." "He said he did not know." Griffin thought for a moment. "But he said he did not know?" Maynard nodded. She also felt that there was a problem, but she could not find any more clues. "Let's put it aside for now. Griffin ran her fingers through her silver hair and adjusted the silver band at the back of her head. Let's go back to the matter. Can this swordsmanship be popularized? That little girl cannot. Miss Maynold observed her for a while, and she did not know much about it. Audiobook shook his head. Unless we can find that person, Griffin raised her head and asked. Right. Both of them nodded. Griffin looked at the knight. Maynold, can't you restore this swordsmanship to its original state? You are one of the rare swordsmanship geniuses in the kingdom. Can't you do anything? She asked. Maynold seemed to be thinking about something. At this moment she regained her senses. I will try my best, but do not have too much hope. After all, I am not a warrior. I mean, this swordsmanship cannot be restored without a certain amount of battle experience. The knight replied calmly. I understand. I will ask Audiobook to help you. Ask him to find a few veterans who experienced the November War to discuss this with you. Griffin thought for a moment. In the near future, other than preparing for the trip to Amperseal, spend more time on this matter. I am very optimistic about the promotion of this swordsmanship, so I will have to trouble the two of you. This old one understands. Yes. Maynold nodded slightly. P.S. Everyone, have you ever seen someone who subscribed to 999 Chidian coins last month, and was just short of 1 Chidian coin, only to end up with no monthly votes this month? Chapter 291. The sound of water dripping came from the darkness. Brando's eyelids twitched, and he finally woke up from the pitch-black environment. He felt that his surroundings were silent, as if he had returned to the beginning of the world. After groaning, his consciousness gradually became clearer, and he subconsciously opened his status panel to take a look. When the faint green light screen appeared out of nowhere in the darkness, Brando finally felt a little more at ease. The status showed that he did not have any fractures or internal injuries, and there were not even any large wounds, just some abrasions and impacts. He then realized that he was worrying too much, and the strength of his body after entering the Golden Realm was not just for show. However, the surroundings were still pitch black, and there was no light. Even if his perception was high, he could not see in complete darkness. However, when he tried to take out the fluorescent gem, he immediately realized that a large amount of heavy earth and rocks were pressing down on his body, making him unable to move. Brando then remembered the scene when he was hit by the collapsed earth and rocks, and that was the main reason why he fainted. But he could not help but feel lucky. If it was a normal person, even if he was lucky enough to escape, he would not be able to escape the fate of suffocation. But then again, if he was just a normal person, he would have died in Bucci. Taking a deep breath, Brando extended his arms outwards, and the power of more than 100 ounces immediately shook the earth and rocks, rolling down. Then he tried again, and with the addition of power burst, he finally broke the earth and rocks pressing down on him. Once he broke free, Brando immediately patted the sand off his body and stood up, but he subconsciously wiped his forehead, and felt that his hand was cold. Stunned for a moment, he immediately took out the fluorescent gem, and under the pale light, he saw that his hand was covered in blood. F***ck Brando cursed and then looked around. The situation outside made him sigh in relief. After the collapse of the tunnel, the passage was not completely sealed. At least there was still a way out. The passage was at the other end of the tunnel, and the torches on the rock wall had long been extinguished, and he did not know where it led to. At this moment, the surrounding environment had greatly changed, and even Brando could not distinguish between north, south, east, and west. He was about to raise the gem and shine it in that direction, but suddenly he heard a groan behind him. Brando was stunned for a moment before he recalled everything that had happened before the earthquake. He turned around and saw the girl from the Grey Wolves mercenaries lying quietly on the other side of the rubble. Scarlet's eyes were tightly shut, and her sharp face was as pale as a sheet of paper under the pale light. Her eyelashes were trembling slightly, but they reflected a rare kind of quiet and gentle beauty. However, the young man was not in the mood to pay attention to this beauty. Instead, he was paying attention to the pool of blood that was dripping from the other party's forehead. This was somewhat abnormal. The strength of an oracle's body was far greater than that of a human's. Logically speaking, Scarlet should not have suffered such superficial wounds. He suddenly thought of a bad guess. so he slowly walked over and squatted down beside her. He reached out and touched the girl's forehead. It was boiling hot. Brendel's heart skipped a beat. He let go of his hand and saw that there was a layer of faint black patterns under the girl's pale forehead. It was growing along her cheeks. This meant that Scarlet's will was fighting against the blood of God. Every time she fell into a coma, it was a serious test for her. Brando thought for a moment, took out a water skin and poured some water on his palm. He then took out the crystal that was once infused with the blood of God and placed it on her forehead. "Scarlet! Wake up!" He shouted twice, and to his relief, the girl's eyelids finally moved under the light, and then she opened her eyes. Her pupils seemed to be shrouded in a terrible layer of black and red at first, but after a while they returned to normal. They turned into a pair of amber burning with a vigorous flame. The burning flame seemed to be the power of life, symbolizing a tenacious will. Scarlet. Scarlet was in a daze at first, but then she reacted. She looked at Brando in confusion and asked weakly, "Commander, Eek?" "It's me." Brando put away the crystal and answered. The red-haired girl hesitated for a moment and said, "My lord?" Then she closed her eyes quietly. She vaguely remembered that she had a nightmare. In her dream she dreamt that she was buried under a blood-red tree. The tree's roots pierced into her body, and the crimson roots wrapped around her, constantly extracting her blood, but she couldn't move at all. This was not the first time she had such a dream, but this time it was particularly clear. She felt a little uneasy and subconsciously thought that the nightmare might be related to the blood of God in her body. "Yes, how is it? Is it okay?" Brando asked worriedly when he saw Scarlet close her eyes. The red-haired girl moved and immediately groaned in pain. She felt that her leg had been injured. Looking down, she found a long wound. Blood was seeping out of her battle robe, dyeing it red. She was a little nervous. Although the rock was sharp, it was not enough to hurt people with their level of strength. Not to mention that she was actually an oracle. Her body's toughness, resistance, and recovery ability were even better than Brando's. This was not normal. The uneasiness in her heart grew stronger. She subconsciously tried to sit up, but the pain made her groan and lie back down. She laid on the ground and gasped for breath. Her forehead was full of cold sweat, but she did not feel the pain at all. Instead, her mind was filled with another thought. Where's my power? She clearly remembered that she had gained the power of gold after she became an oracle. Didn't the Lord say the same thing? But she felt that she had no power at all. It was a feeling she had not felt for many years. She was weak and powerless just like an ordinary person. Her power disappeared. The girl laid on the ground, her eyes out of focus. She suddenly felt a little helpless. When Makarov disbanded the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she had such an experience. Everything that she could rely on in the past seemed to have lost its meaning. It was as if she was choked by a great despair. She could not breathe. It was Brando who brought her out of this hopeless situation. The young lord gathered most of the original members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries and gave her a reason to continue living. It was not easy for her to walk out of this shadow and adapt to a new life. It could even be said that she liked this kind of life. At least in the past, the most outstanding people in Makarov's eyes were Eek and Yuta. She was just an insignificant member. But in this place, whether it was because of the power of gold from the blood of God or not, at least she could feel that Brando valued her. Her existence was not insignificant. She was also one of the most important forces in the Lord's group. Moreover, she could continue to fight side by side with the original members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. This made Scarlet feel satisfied, even if it was very short. She had expected that she would one day become an oracle and lose everything she had now. But she did not expect that Martha was playing a joke on her. When she just blended into the environment, she found that her power had completely disappeared. Right now, she was no different from a normal person. She was even weaker than a normal person. But she knew that a noble did not need a useless retainer. Even though she was also a normal person, she admitted that she was not as smart and knowledgeable as Martha. She could not help but tremble when she thought of this. What's wrong? Brando saw that Scarlet's face was pale and did not say a word. My lord, Scarlet said in a small voice. I don't have any power. Brando was stunned. It was normal to lose too much blood, but he felt that it was a little strange. Logically speaking, an oracle's body should not be so heavily injured. But what was even stranger was Scarlet's strange words. This girl was lying on the ground, her face pale and weak. She said to him weakly, "My lord, I don't have any power." What does this mean? Is she asking me to help her up? If it was a young Roman, Brando could understand. But in his impression, Scarlet was an introverted girl. Not to mention acting coquettishly, she was almost as expressionless as Falerne. There must be a reason for this abnormality. Brando carefully observed to see if Scarlet had become an oracle. She pretended to be like this to ambush him, but he was very familiar with the signs of an oracle. She did not look like she was controlled by the blood of gods. He showed a puzzled expression. But Scarlet's mind was in a mess. She did not notice Brando's confusion. Her mind was filled with the ruthless look of Makarov, who she regarded as both a father and a teacher. She could not help but repeat her words. "My lord, I don't have any power left. I'm afraid I can't keep up with you." Brando was stunned again. What's going on? However, he suddenly understood and asked tentatively, "You've lost your gold power?" Scarlet's face paled and nodded slowly. "I see." Brando nodded. This time it was Scarlet's turn to be stunned. Scarlet had imagined Brando's reaction more than once. She was afraid that the same thing would happen again. But she did not expect Brendel's reaction, as if he suddenly realized something. "It's nothing." Brando shook his head. He knew that what happened to Scarlet was not a good sign. It meant that the conflict between the blood of gods had intensified. When she regained her power, she would become a true oracle. It would not take too long. It would take at most a few days or at least a few hours. At that time, her power would reach a new level. But she would no longer be her original self. But of course, he could not tell her directly. He comforted her. "It's all right. Can't you stand up?" Scarlet was completely stunned. She nodded in confusion. Brando extended his hand. "Let me help you." Brando's voice was not loud when he said this. It was even a little gentle out of sympathy for the poor girl. Scarlet felt as if his words had penetrated all defenses and hit her heart. She felt tears welling up in her eyes. P.S. These 2 chapters are written very smoothly. Is this love? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 292. Brendel was stunned when he saw the tears rolling down Scarlet's cheeks. "What's wrong?" The girl let her tears fall as if she didn't hear him and only reacted after a while. She sniffed to calm her emotions and finally realized that she had lost her composure. Her cheeks flushed red. "It's nothing. It's too painful." Scarlet turned her head away and answered reluctantly, "My lord." Brando felt like crying in his heart. Isn't this excuse a little too clumsy? Does it look like she's crying because she's in too much pain? It's more appropriate to say that she's trying to hide her panic. He wasn't an idiot and could roughly guess what she was thinking. Even though he didn't know what she thought of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Makarov and himself, he could see that her silence couldn't hide her avoidance of the past. Rather than saying that she had accepted everything, it was more like she was still stuck in her memories. She seemed to have an instinctive fear and distrust of the outside world. If she left everything she was familiar with, she would be surrounded by a great sense of isolation. He did not know what she had experienced in the past, but he knew that the maned wolf Makarov's actions must have caused great harm to her. "Can you stand up?" He threw those thoughts away and asked. Scarlet nodded weakly, but she tried a few times. Even though she was holding Brando's hand, the pain was so intense that she couldn't help but whimper and kneel down. Brando saw the red-haired girl grit her teeth as she cried and tried her best to stand up. He couldn't bear to see her like this. Even though he had seen women cry before, but compared to the girls in the game who had tears in their eyes, Scarlet's strength was more admirable. Moreover, he was a man after all. "Don't hold on anymore, I'll carry you," Brando said. They couldn't stay here for too long. Even though they didn't know the situation of Coden and Medisha who were sealed on the other side, they couldn't stay here for too long. However, if the old man returned to the surface before them, their mission would be a complete failure. They had to race against time. "How can I?" Scarlet was stunned. What kind of lord would do such a thing? Perhaps Makarov would do something like that, but she knew that it was to buy people's hearts, just like how the Grand Commander did not care about her in the past. She did not understand why, and no matter how well she did, she would never get as much attention as Eek. But later on, she finally understood that even if you wanted to buy people's hearts, you still needed to have the qualifications to be bought. Of course, Scarlet wouldn't be jealous of the person she loved, but she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. A guy who didn't even have the strength of a silver rank might not even be as good as Rady in the eyes of the captain. Thinking of the white-haired young man who had been killed by Brando, the red-haired girl couldn't help but feel a wave of disgust. But what was the young lord's purpose? She didn't have any strength left and didn't have any reputation among the remaining members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She was even weaker than Sanford. She had to admit that she was not as beautiful as the merchant girl who was announced to be his fiancée. Brando only had physical contact with the latter, let alone her. There's no need. She thought for a moment and shook her head. My lord, you should leave first. You can come and save me after you control the mine. She paused for a moment and said hesitantly, I'm a mercenary and I won't be too scared alone. At most, my lord, please leave me a piece of illuminating crystal. Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he looked at the fear written all over her face. It was still a problem whether they could find a way out, but even if they were lucky, it would take at least a few hours for them to return. Leaving a defenseless girl like her alone was not dangerous, and the most important thing was that she might turn into an angel the moment he left her. But he thought for a moment and didn't say it directly. Instead, he replied tactfully, You've lost too much blood. It's dangerous for you to stay here. It's fine, the red-haired girl shook her head. This is also Lady Martha's will. Besides, there's no need for you to bring a burden with you. She paused for a moment and her voice became weak. Actually, thank you, my lord. It's enough that you don't want to leave Scarlet behind. The girl took a deep breath and forced a smile. So, I can't be selfish, right? Brando was stunned when he heard this. He looked at Scarlet's beautiful amber eyes. There was even a trace of mist in them, but in the end, they were still dim and lifeless. He suddenly understood. Such an outstanding girl wouldn't have met such a fate if she was born in Wonde. But did Wonde ever have a peaceful life? The reason why the Amber Sword set this world to be one of strife and turbulence was because a game needed a turbulent environment to write an epic chapter. But what was an epic? For this world it was nothing more than flames burning the earth, bones piling up, and rivers of blood flowing. In Wonde, where the borders of civilization were constantly being nibbled away, wars became more frequent. Because of the need for survival, on one hand, humans became more collective, but on the other hand, they became more utilitarian and practical. The consequence was that the existence of the individual became insignificant. The warmth between people had long disappeared, and the whole society was filled with a sense of coldness when it was formed, cold and efficient. Although in Erewhon, there was more and more resistance because of the incompetent nobles holding the ruling power of the country, but this resistance was not to overthrow the system of this world. In the end, it was because the people at the bottom generally doubted the legitimacy of the ruler. This legitimacy had nothing to do with blood or birth, and the only criterion was strength. The strong were respected, and the weak seemed to be left to fend for themselves. As a modern person, Brando did not object to the former, but he did not agree with the latter. He knew that Scarlet's story was not unique in this world. There were thousands of Scarlets in this world, just like how there were thousands of Sifrids. If not for him, the little girl from the Green Village would not have ended up any better than the red-haired girl in front of him. Was it not? In fact, there were many people in this world who were more unfortunate than them. He was powerless to change all of this. This was different from changing the fate of Erewhon. It was a rebellion against the will of the world itself. This will not only represented the power of a huge society, but also the laws of nature that formed this power. After all, this was a different world from Earth. Brando's selfish wish was to save the kingdom. As for whether this wish would hurt more people, he did not think too much about it. These people might come from other countries such as Madara, Cruz, or even the oppression of the kingdom itself. Brando only hoped that the people he was familiar with, whether it was the princess, the Valkyrie, or the people who sacrificed their lives for the kingdom, would not repeat the tragedy that happened to them. Rewriting history, that was all. When a tragedy like Scarlett's happened, he did not think that he could turn a blind eye to it. When Brando heard Scarlett's words, he shook his head and said, "You're thinking too much. Do you think I'm such a useless person?" But Scarlett was still hesitating. An excellent leader will never leave any of his members behind. Brando felt that he should say something cool like this at this moment. He remembered that this sentence was told to him by his senior sister when she handed the team over to him. But he found that he could not be serious at all. In the end, he could only shake his head and make a clumsy joke. "Don't worry, I won't take advantage of you." But Brando was about to cry when he said this. He felt that he had embarrassed himself as a transmigrator. Scarlett was not any better. Her face was completely red, and she quickly shook her head. "Of course not, it's just..." "No, it's just..." Brando felt that he would go crazy if he continued talking. He simply carried Scarlett with both hands without saying a word, completely ignoring the latter's frightened cry. She was dumbfounded. She never dreamed that Brando would be so forceful. Her mind was in a mess. He just said that he won't take advantage of me." But the girl immediately buried her head in her chest like an ostrich. Her ears were red, and her heart was thumping. She could not say a word. She wondered if this was the legendary Princess Carrie. When she was in the mercenary group, she had wondered more than once if Eek would carry her to the Holy Cathedral one day. But this little extravagant hope had long since turned into a beautiful fantasy after Yura appeared. But this red-haired girl never thought that one day someone would really carry her like this. It was just that this person wasn't the one she had imagined, and the pitch-black tunnel seemed a little too eerie. But when she leaned her head against Brando's chest like an ostrich, she felt an inexplicable sense of security even though her heart was beating fast. "My lord is different from most people I've met," she thought. "He's also different from Eek. When I'm by his side, I feel a strange sense of security and trust. This feeling is probably the same for Amandina, and the Roman lady as well. They should all be able to feel it." Scarlett suddenly understood why there were more and more people gathering around Brando in the past few months. Although this was not unrelated to the young man's personal ability, there were many people in Wonde who had more background and ability than him. But today she finally found the reason. She lightly clicked her tongue, thinking that she was lucky to be able to follow such a lord. It seemed that Lady Martha had not completely abandoned her. But the prospect of losing her power still made her feel a little gloomy. She knew that she was not a genius, and it would not be easy to regain her power. But she shook her head and threw this thought away. She would just take it one day at a time. Brando's every move had made her completely relieved. But when she thought this, she did not know that she only had a few days or even a few hours to live. P.S. If you're in a situation where your results are good, you really don't want to ask for support. Chapter 293. The two of them walked in the dark tunnel, with only the dim light from the illuminating crystals illuminating the path ahead. The collapse did not only happen in the area where they fought. Brando saw signs of the collapse everywhere. Piles of earth and rocks blocked most of the tunnel. Some places were completely blocked off. Even though he could break through the rocks in these places, he still chose to take a detour in order to not cause a second collapse. Scarlett leaned on Brando's body, clearly feeling the young lord's strong heartbeat. She felt her own heart pounding as well. The red-haired girl's face was a little hot. She felt that she should say something to break the awkward silence, but she did not know where to start. She thought for a while and decided to change the topic. "Where are the others?" Brando shook his head. He remembered that he, Scarlett, Coden, and Medisha were separated. Yuta was even further away, and he did not know where she was now. He searched for Medisha's card in his mind. The silver card did not turn gray, which meant that the silver elf princess was not in any danger. "I'm not sure, but it doesn't seem like a big problem." He recalled that when the collapse happened, Medisha and Coden were sealed together. Since she was not in danger, it was very likely that Coden was in trouble. Brando knew that Medisha alone was no match for Coden. Scarlett replied. "Is your wound okay?" Brando asked. He was worried that the red-haired girl was suddenly so talkative. He was worried that the blood of God would act up prematurely. "No." Scarlett quickly changed the topic. "But it's a little strange." "What's wrong?" "We had just started fighting." Now that I think about it, it didn't seem like it would cause such a large earthquake. Brando fell silent. In fact, he had been wondering about this ever since he woke up. Although it was dangerous for 4 gold-tier fighters to fight in the mine, they had only fought a few times. Other than his first White Raven sword style, he had not used any other powerful skills. Even if he was a gold-tier swordsman, he would be no different from an ordinary person. It was not as if such a person would cause an earthquake when he walked into the mines. It was just that he didn't have time to think too much about it back then. Now that he looked back, he found many suspicious points. He wondered if he was unlucky enough to encounter an earthquake. If that was the case, then Lady Martha's joke was a bit too much. However, regardless of whether it was an earthquake or not, this doubt could only remain at the level of speculation for now. They could only come to a conclusion after they reached the ground and learned how big the impact of the collapse was. But now Brando had no choice but to weave through the dark, crisscrossing underground tunnels like a mole. As time passed, he began to suspect that the area he was in had been sealed off. However, when he came to a dead end for the 3rd time, Brando finally confirmed it. However, after such a long search, it was not all for naught. At least he found out that the elevator he used to go up to this floor could still be used. The only bad news was that the elevator could only go up to the 4th floor. The 4th floor of the mine was connected to the 3rd floor, but the 5th floor was connected to the beehive. It was a complicated cave system, and from there one could enter the 4th floor. Perhaps one could enter the 3rd floor from another area. Brando had asked Joka before he entered the mine. There were a total of 5 elevators from the 3rd to the 4th floor. Although the area he was in was sealed off by the falling rocks, the other areas on the 3rd floor might not be the same. He made a decision in a short time and brought Scarlet to the 4th floor to try his luck. The elevator hit the rock and stopped with a heavy thud. Brando was no stranger to this floor of the mine. In fact, he came up from here before. The 4th floor was also dark, but under the light of the illuminating crystal, Brando immediately noticed that the 4th floor had also collapsed. He looked up at the loose rock at the top of the tunnel and the dirt on the ground. However, the rock here was more solid, so the tunnel suffered less damage than the previous one. Brando was more and more confused. He was more and more certain that the earthquake he encountered before was a coincidence. But how could there be such a coincidence? If this was really an earthquake, then it should have happened in the Amber Sword in the past. In the game, Tonajal was considered a low-level area in the transition to a mid-level area. Based on the game's timeline, some players should have just arrived here. He couldn't help but recall the posts related to the earthquake. These posts should be more common in Erewhon, but they were relatively rare in Erewhon. Something like this should have left an impression in his memory. But when he thought about it, he couldn't remember seeing any posts related to it on the forum. But he suddenly remembered something. There was indeed something related to Tonajal on the forum during this period. It was a strange post. Brando remembered that the post was a post asking for an appraisal. The appraisal was cold iron ore and 2 other unknown items. When the words cold iron ore flashed through Brando's mind, it immediately alerted him. He immediately recalled the title of the post. He remembered that the title of the post was, "A large number of cold iron ore for sale," and also asking to appraise 2 items that have never been seen before. To be honest, there were at least 800, if not 1,000 posts like this on the forum during that era. After all, players had only been in the game for a few months, and there were too many new things that the players had not seen before. It was difficult for Brando to remember such a post. But in that era, when players did not have any high-level materials, the sudden appearance of a large number of cold iron ore made this post popular. At that time, some people even doubted the authenticity of this post, but it also made Brando remember this post. But his memory of this post was quite vague. He had already forgotten most of the main post's content. He could only vaguely remember that the poster seemed to have received a mission, and then found 2 strange items in a cold iron ore vein when he was mining. As for why he accepted the mission to mine, Brando could not remember. But he remembered the strange items clearly. The first item was the diagonal quartz. That was the first time the magic eye stone appeared on the forum as a material. And the second item, from the picture, he remembered that it was a silver ball. In the end, the discussion of this item did not reach a conclusion. But it did not disappear from the public's sight. In fact, later on, there were people who found and learned about the origin of this silver ball from other places. Silver legacy. In the Pale poem of the Cruise people, there was an era before the Age of Chaos, before Martha created the world. It was called the Age of Dusk. Legend has it that in that ancient era, there were gold and silver people living in the Age of Chaos, and there were even legendary divine people. There was a saying that Martha was one of the divine people, but there was another saying that Martha was created by the divine people. But what kind of existence the divine people were was long unknown. In fact, except for ancient myths like the Pale poem, they had never appeared in the world of the Amber Sword. Even the widely spread bards on the continent, and most of the half-true rumors were not mentioned in the slightest. So, similar to how Martha was referred to as a reference to the rules, the divine people were referred to as a reference to reality. Players usually thought that the divine people referred to the game designer. So, in contrast to Martha's half-reality and half-virtual existence, the divine people should be completely realistic and synonymous with non-existent in the game. But one thing was very clear. Historical records did say that the divine people led the first gold and silver generation to create the first sage's sanctuary. Then, Martha used these points to create the world of Wond with the support of the elemental code. The formation of the world took a long time. The first gold and silver people relied on the sanctuary to resist the attack of the Twilight Dragon. Until the last sanctuary recorded in history, the Babel of Babel, was destroyed. Then came the era when the gold and silver bloodlines were scattered across the land, which was the beginning of the Age of Chaos. History before and after that had been buried in the dust. The gold and silver bloodlines had also wandered the land for countless years and almost disappeared. But the ruins of the sanctuary were not completely destroyed. Just like the fairyland of the King of Knights that Brando led the refugees of Fortress Reden into when they fled, the ruins of the sanctuary were widespread in this world. Some were half-physical, such as hidden in the crevices of space and time, such as the fairyland. Some were completely imaginary, such as the legendary Babel of Babel, the unbreakable last fortress that existed at the top of the world. But there were also some that were the most physical, and most of these were the Silver Folk's sanctuaries. These sanctuaries were the most thoroughly destroyed in the war. For example, the steel plains sunk into the ground, and the runic dwarves were almost wiped out. And some were left as ruins, becoming sacred places today. The most famous one that Brando knew was the Gate to Heaven in the Kingdom of Knights. But there were also some that were unknown, such as the Dusty Kingdom and Valhalla. But in any case, some of these shelters were not empty. Just like archaeology, people who entered could often find something inside. This was the legacy of the gold people and the silver people. In fact, the golden apple in Brando's hand was a kind of gold legacy. In terms of quality, although the legacy of the silver folk was a little inferior, the effect would not be that bad. Thinking of this, Brando could already guess that the previous earthquake was completely likely caused by the magical resonance caused by the unearthing of the high-grade holy object. The magic eye gem, the cold iron ore. He had almost confirmed where this mission was. Just relying on the legacy of the silver folk alone did not seem to be enough to cause such a big commotion. Brando was a little puzzled. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 294. Not long after they entered the 4th level, Brando suddenly heard Scarlet whisper, "My lord. What's wrong? Let me try." The girl's voice was almost inaudible. Brando looked down and found that the body of an oracle was indeed worthy of its reputation. Although she had lost her strength, her body's recovery ability was still much stronger than the average person. Brando saw that the wound on her thigh had stopped bleeding and formed a scab. He hesitated for a moment and asked, "Is it okay?" But under the girl's insistence, Brando finally helped her down. Scarlet frowned slightly when her feet touched the ground, but after a while she stood steadily. Although she was a little slow, she could barely walk by herself with the support of the lightning spear. After discovering this, Scarlet seemed to be a little happy. She happily raised her head and smiled at Brando. "My lord." Brando rarely saw such a heartfelt smile from Scarlet. He could not help but be slightly startled. But the latter quickly realized that she had lost her composure and turned her head away. Brando actually thought that the red-haired girl looked pretty when she smiled, but of course he would never say that out loud. The two maintained their silence as they walked through the low tunnel. Not long after, Brando suddenly saw a faint white thing in the darkness ahead. He softly exclaimed in surprise. "What's wrong?" Scarlet asked from behind. "There seems to be something," Brando explained in a low voice. He knew that Scarlet's vision was no different from that of an ordinary person. In this environment it was difficult to see far away. Although there was an illuminating crystal, the light was too bad. He pulled out his sword with one hand and slowly walked over with the girl. Finally, he saw that it was a person lying on the ground. It seemed to be a miner here. He carefully looked at the person and did not find any obvious wounds on his body. "He's not dead yet." Scarlet looked at the person and immediately judged. Brando also saw that the person's chest was rising and falling slightly. It seemed that he had just fainted. He nodded and tried to shout, but did not wake up. So he pulled out the cork on the water bag and flicked some water on the person's forehead. Considering that they did not know how long they would be trapped underground, and the amount of fresh water they had with them was limited, Brando subconsciously lightened his movements. Fortunately, his method worked quickly. The miner didn't seem to have suffered any injuries, and he quickly blinked and woke up. But as soon as it opened its eyes and saw the two of them, it subconsciously shrank back and crashed into the cold rock wall. Brando looked at his uneasy expression and hurriedly said, "We are also from here. You don't have to worry." The miner was stunned for a moment before he came to his senses. He took a deep breath and looked at the two of them carefully before he calmed down and asked, "Are you in charge? Supervisor? Or are they from the guards?" He saw Brando's sword and Scarlet's halberd. In this mine, only the supervisors and soldiers would carry weapons, but Brando and Scarlet were not wearing the guard's uniform, so they looked more like the latter. "We are from the guards." Brando knew that the miner knew almost every foreman, so he answered. The man was obviously relieved, but he quickly became nervous again. "Did you also encounter a monster?" He saw the blood on Scarlet's body. "Monster?" Brando looked back and exchanged glances with Scarlet. The monster here was probably the wind spirit spiders that he had summoned, but he frowned and asked, "What kind of monster?" Brando had used the wind spirit spiders to scout the way on the third floor, but Brando instinctively felt that things were not that simple. "Stone statue, a monster that looks like a stone statue." Martha above. "A monster that looks like a stone statue?" Scarlet squatted down beside Brando and asked softly, "Stone statue?" Brando thought that there were many monsters enwombed in the form of rocks, and the typical ones were the gargoyle sentinels and war golems made by the Buga wizards. But considering the environment here, it was more likely that it was a stone elemental. Brando thought for a moment and comforted the miner. "Don't be afraid. We are here. Slowly think about what the monsters looked like. Were they humanoid? Or were they beast-shaped?" The miner took a deep breath and said, "They looked like beasts, but they were all made of rocks. Sir, I swear I didn't see wrong." "Beast-shaped? Did they have wings?" "No," the miner answered without hesitation. Brando was puzzled. He had never heard of such monsters in the form of rocks. Although there were many kinds of monsters and monsters enwombed, most of them could be traced back to their origins. For example, monsters in the form of soil and rocks were either magic golems, or related to the earth elemental world. But except for the gargoyle sentinels, beast-shaped monsters were very rare. The creatures in the earth elemental world were mostly insect-shaped. But when he saw that the miner was suspicious again, he quickly calmed him down and asked, "Is there anyone else here other than you?" He knew that the miners usually entered the mine in groups. The miner gulped as if he just remembered something. He quickly nodded and said, "Yes," he said. "I came with my group, but we were separated when we encountered the monsters." He could not help but look into the depths of the cave and said with uncertainty, "I don't know where they went. I don't know if they are still alive. The monsters might have gone after them." He seemed to be relieved, but he was also a little scared. "Right." The miner suddenly remembered something. "Lord Mahan is here too." "Lord Mahan? You don't know him." The miner was slightly stunned. "He is the foreman of this area. I heard that he used to be in the army. His swordsmanship is very good. When the earthquake started, he said that he would go to the front to take a look, and then the monsters appeared." Brando was speechless. He almost let the cat out of the bag when he asked. Fortunately, the miner was not very vigilant when he saw his own people. But Scarlet frowned slightly. Didn't the collapse start in an instant when the earthquake started? Also, why did he go to the front to take a look? As someone who became a mercenary at a very young age, her way of thinking was much sharper than Brando's. Brando heard her and reacted. You're right. Shouldn't he be looking for a safe place to hide? No, the miner quickly waved his hand. The earthquake wasn't that bad at first and the rock layer below is relatively sturdy, so the collapse wasn't that bad. The thing is, the earthquake came from the south. Didn't you feel it? The earthquake came from the south. This unexpected information made Brando react. It seemed that his guess was not far from the truth. There was indeed something incredible that was dug out from the Schaflund mine. But even though he did not know them, he was still worried for Cohen and the other youths. They must be dead by now. Brando could not help but sigh. It doesn't seem to be an earthquake, Scarlet whispered. My lord. Brando had already made up his mind to go to the front to take a look. Even though the silver legacy was not as rare as the golden apple, it was still a rare item. But with such a valuable reward, the mission would not be so simple. He suddenly interrupted Scarlet and put a finger to his lips. Shoo! The tunnel quieted down, and only the miner's heavy breathing could be heard. But soon, Scarlet and the miner heard a rustling sound coming from the south. It was as if something was moving close to the ground. They're here. The miner's face turned pale in an instant. But Brendel put down his sword with some doubts in his heart. There were many things coming. But these slightly heavy footsteps didn't sound like they were anything powerful. But soon, the monsters that the miner spoke of appeared one by one. The first to appear was a gray-white feline. It gracefully stepped into the light of the illuminating crystal, and stared at Brando with a pair of eyes that looked like gray gemstones. No, it should be said that it was a pair of gray gemstones. This was because the slender feline was actually a stone statue. A living stone statue with gray crystals as its eyes. Brando immediately understood when he saw this thing. It was not a monster in the form of a rock. It was a summoned creature. To be more precise, it was a creature formed from the earth elemental. As for what form it took, it was entirely up to the summoner's will. But Brando was slightly taken aback. There's an elven summoner down there? This thought flashed through his mind. Or is there something controlling these creatures unconsciously? It seemed that the latter possibility was much more obvious. But if it was a piece of equipment with self-consciousness, even if it had no intelligence, it would be at least fantasy level or above. And it might even be an extremely high fantasy level. When Brando thought of this, he suddenly burst into tears. He thought that since he came to this world, he could finally see high-level equipment for the first time. As he thought of this, more and more felines appeared in the darkness. There were more than 10 of them, and there were a few pairs of shimmering eyes swaying beyond the boundary of light. More than 20 rock panthers had formed a semicircular encirclement around them. Brando did not panic at all. He stepped forward and put down his sword. Stay back, Scarlet. Scarlet grabbed the miner, who was so scared that his legs went soft and was about to roll and crawl away. Then she turned back and nodded at Brando, and obediently stepped back a little. She knew that she did not have any power now. At most, she relied on her strength as an oracle to be slightly stronger than ordinary people. If she stayed on the front line, she could only interfere with Brando's actions. However, although she had lost her power, her vision was still there. She had already seen that these big rock panthers did not seem to be a threat, especially to Brando. On the 19th, my relative is getting married. I'm not sure if I'll be updating, but I'll make up for it if it's missing. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 295. However, Scarlet could understand the other party's strength, and this miner was different from them. As soon as he was caught by Scarlet, he couldn't help but scream in fear. Let me go. You guys run too, those things are very powerful, they're invulnerable. He had seen his companions use their pickaxes to fight back against the monsters. Even if they used all their strength, they could only leave a shallow white mark on the monster's body. And when the monsters retaliated, their claws could easily crush half of a person's body. That nightmarish scene was still fresh in his mind. But before he could finish his sentence, the second half of his sentence was stuck in his throat. In his dark brown eyes, Brendel lightly swung his sword to the right, and the rock panther that was about to attack them was sliced into two like tofu. The two halves of the rock panther's body crashed heavily into the side of the cliff and shattered into pieces. The miner was dumbfounded. He pointed at Brando, looked at Scarlet, and then at the young man. He stuttered for a moment, unable to form a complete sentence. "Stop arguing." Scarlet impatiently slapped his hand away, but she also looked at Brando. When she saw Brando attack, she couldn't help but exclaim in her heart, "My lord's swordsmanship has improved again." Brendel's swordsmanship had indeed improved, and he only realized this after he dismembered the rock panther that was not even at the iron-ranked level. He opened the interface and found that the suffix behind his military swordsmanship had changed to +2. Although he didn't know how this +2 came about, it probably had something to do with Coden, the guard captain of the mine. He must have missed the system notification when he was buried by the rocks and passed out. Brando couldn't help but feel a little surprised and happy. Although it wasn't like the game didn't have examples of players receiving bonuses by experiencing the swordsmanship of high-tier NPC swordsmen, it wasn't much different from completing a swordsmanship quest. All the conditions had to be met, and the conditions were usually much harsher than the quest. Just like the last time when he comprehended his grandfather's swordsmanship in Brendel's dream. Firstly, it was because Sophie's soul had a high enough understanding of swordsmanship. Secondly, it was because Brendel and his grandfather were inextricably linked. Coupled with the fact that he had surpassed himself, it was natural for his swordsmanship to improve. But this time it was a little strange. Of course, before Brando could finish thinking, another rock panther pounced on him. Brando instinctively swung his sword and sent it flying, but he was starting to get impatient with these annoying little things. He took a step back and directly charged into the encirclement. This time, the miner's expression not only froze, but he also fell to the ground. He didn't know there was such a powerful swordsman in the garrison. The illuminating crystal in Brendel's hand drew a bright arc in the dark underground tunnel. In the next moment, several rock panthers were cut in two. When the silver mine earthquake happened, Shaflun town was the first to receive the news. The edge of the earthquake affected the town, and the people standing on the street could feel the ground shaking. The shop owners on both sides of the street immediately pressed down on their plates to prevent them from falling to the ground and shattering. Of course, losses were unavoidable. For example, the owners of several pottery shops cursed. But the wider impact was that the news of the mine earthquake quickly spread throughout the town. Most of the women, children, and elderly living here had relatives who worked in the mines, so a sense of panic quickly spread. The rumor spread like wildfire in the town, and it didn't take long for the Roman girl to hear about it. In fact, the merchant girl stayed in her room and tried on the long dress that Brando gave her. It was something that Brando saw by chance in town, and it looked like a maid's outfit. He then remembered that he didn't give anything to the Roman, so he bought it with an ulterior motive. Of course, although his motive was a little dark, the Roman liked it very much. Of course, if it weren't for the fact that she was trying on clothes when the earthquake happened and bumped her head into the mirror frame, resulting in a red and swollen bump on her forehead, this incident would have looked even more perfect. The Roman was dizzy from the impact, but she was very curious. She immediately got up and rushed out of the door to ask the two angels what happened. The two angels naturally said that they didn't know anything. In the end, the merchant girl received accurate information from the innkeeper. There was an earthquake in the mine. Roman blinked his eyes. After carefully considering what the so-called earthquake was, he immediately became worried. She thought for a moment and made a serious decision. "I'm going to find Brando," she said to the two angels seriously. "Both of you will come with me." "Miss Roman, Master will not agree to such a thing." The first angel replied. "Master ordered us to stay in this inn until he returns. You are not allowed to run around." The second angel's words were obviously much more direct. "Besides, we are still fine. This means that Master is fine," the first angel advised. The Roman said in a methodical manner, "Brando is fine now. That's why we have to help him. Maybe he is trapped underground." If Brando knew that the Roman's words would come true, He would probably teach her a lesson. He would tell the merchant girl that since she knew that she had a crow's mouth, she shouldn't speak carelessly. Unfortunately, he didn't know. Therefore, the merchant girl was still very lively for the time being. However, the two angels didn't agree with her idea. They shook their heads and agreed that the merchant girl's idea would have a better future in a more meaningful field. For example, writing fairy tales. The Roman merchant girl knew that her request was rejected, but she wasn't discouraged. In fact, she didn't even know how to write the word discouraged. Not long after, the two angels who were doing their duty heard a loud shout coming from the room. Thinking that it was better to be safe than sorry, they rushed in at the first moment, only to see little Romaine wearing a long purple dress, her head covered in a blanket as she rolled around on the bed. In other words, she was acting like a spoiled child. When she felt the two angels rushing in, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeked outside. She puffed up her cheeks and said, "I want to go to the mine." The unspoken message in his eyes was, "Otherwise, I'll make a scene for you all to see." The two angels looked at each other and shrugged. They closed the door and left without saying a word. After repeating this for 2 or 3 times, they gradually learned to turn a blind eye to the merchant girl's strange behavior. His lordship told us not to make a fuss over nothing. Seems that it makes sense. The first angel said to his companion when he heard the merchant girl rolling around on the floor for the umpteenth time. His lordship is always far-sighted. I can see that he knows the Roman girl very well. The second angel nodded. His lordship likes the Roman girl very much. The two angels finally reached a consensus. But what they didn't know was that the merchant girl, who was full of strange thoughts, was changing her clothes. When she noticed that Brando's two detestable subordinates were no longer surprised by her behavior and wouldn't enter the room no matter what they heard, she revealed a cunning smile. She methodically began to carry out her plan. She had changed into the usual traveler's clothing. She wore a pair of very fluffy pumpkin trousers and pointed leather boots, which made her look extremely comical. But when paired with the merchant lady's temperament of looking left and right, it complemented each other and made her look unusually cute. Then she put all her strange things into a small backpack, pulled up the bedsheet, opened the window and jumped out. She even made a funny face at the door. But unfortunately, the merchant girl had thought of everything. But she neglected the most important point. She grabbed the bedsheet with one hand and carefully stepped on the tiles below with her little leather boots as she prepared to slide to the street behind the inn. Suddenly, she noticed a problem. The bedsheet wasn't long enough. Little Roman grabbed the bedsheet and swung back and forth in the air. His flat and smooth forehead was a little shiny. It seems like I've met with a little trouble," she thought. The old dwarf, Odom, was passing through the alleyway as usual to enjoy his afternoon ale at the Trout in the forest. When he raised his head, he saw this strange scene. At first, he thought that he was still asleep, so he couldn't help but rub his eyes. Then, he finally confirmed that he wasn't mistaken. There was a girl wearing baggy pumpkin shorts holding a bedsheet and swinging it over her head not far away. The old dwarf lowered his head and thought about whether it was a carnival or something similar. However, he could not remember whether the last festival was the Midsummer Festival or the Harvest Festival. He sighed at how his memory deteriorated so quickly when he got old. Then he remembered that the last festival had been a few weeks ago, and the next one was still a month or 2 away. He thought that he must have entered the wrong place. Or maybe there was something wrong with the way he entered the alleyway. However, he immediately realized that it was the window at the back of the Trout in the Forest Inn. Wasn't it? Thinking until here, the old dwarf finally woke up from his dazed state. He raised his head and stared at the young girl who was swaying in midair. He used his hand to support his chin and asked, "Little girl, what are you doing?" "I'm sorry, old man. The bedsheet is too short." That was the Roman's first answer. "On the 19th, my relative is getting married. I'm not sure if I'll be updating, but I'll make up for it if it's missing." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading.